Chapter 1. A steady rainfall pattered against the canopy covering the gravesite in her family's small cemetery plot as the preacher from Deadwood said the words that made Willa Griffin's grandfather's death final. Still, she didn't cry. Her grandfather, a brawny, tough-talking old man, would have cuffed her upside the head and told her to knock it off, and old habits did die hard. She'd started tearing up at his bedside once toward the end of his illness, and he'd bawled her out so bad, she'd quit immediately, afraid he'd give himself a stroke. But, in the end, cancer had gotten him. She looked away from the coffin and across the land that had been in her family for generations. In the distance, a huge herd of black Angus grazed on the hillside, the bread and butter of the Circle G ranch. She loved every bit of the 900 acres of rolling property in the Black Hills of South Dakota, and now, it was up to her to keep things going. They hadn't talked about it before the cancer took him, but she was sure that was what her grandfather would have wanted. He'd raised her to know everything she'd need to know to take over someday. As the preacher finished, the cowboys that worked her family's land filed past her one by one, shaking her hand, giving her a sympathetic pat on the shoulder, or just nodding respectfully, their hats clutched in their hands. She held it together until Brody, her ranch foreman, came along last in line. "You okay, Will?" he asked, his handsome face concerned, his brown eyes sad. Brody had been with the Circle G for the last 15 years, ever since she was a scrawny 10-year-old with a huge crush. That crush had mellowed into a friendship, her only close one, and she loved Brody like a brother. She nodded and pushed a damp strand of hair back from her face. Clearing her throat, she said, "If you can get the stock moved to the new pasture this afternoon, I'd appreciate it. I've got some paperwork to deal with." Brody nodded. He gave her shoulder a squeeze and followed the rest of the ranch hands back toward the barns. He knew her better than to suggest she take the afternoon off. Willa turned to thank Pastor Highland. "I'm here for you, Willa," the short, pudgy man said kindly, wiping rain from where it threatened to run down the back of his collar. "The whole congregation is, and we're just a phone call away." She nodded her thanks, not trusting herself to speak. "We'd love to see you back at church, whenever you feel up to it." She just nodded again. She hadn't been to church since her grandma had passed away when she was 5 years old. She believed in God, but, like her grandfather, she'd rather worship him out here on horseback in the Black Hills, where she felt closest to heaven. "Forget the paperwork," she thought as the preacher's truck rattled away, and she tugged her wide-brimmed hat down firmly over her head. She'd saddle up Star and go ride the fences. She could use a little time with him today. The next morning, Willa was feeling more settled when Franklin Dowling, her grandfather's lawyer, came by with a copy of her grandfather's will. The settled feeling didn't last long. "He said what?" she roared, pushing her chair back from her grandfather's big antique desk so hard that it banged against the wall. Dowling, not a small man himself, cowered back a little in his chair when Willa drew herself angrily up to her full height of 5 feet 8 inches, her black eyes flashing fire. Just now, she looked exactly like Old Man Griffin when he had his dander up, he thought. "Now, Willa," he said, holding up a hand, but she interrupted. "Don't you now, Willa me, Franklin. I know this ranch inside out and upside down. How dare he say I need to hitch myself to a man just to run it?" But those were the terms of Richard Griffin's will, and he'd made it clear he didn't want Willa to run the ranch. His granddaughter had to marry within 30 days of his death if she wanted to keep it, and if she failed to do so, it would go to his cousin's son Justin. Justin was a no-account loser in his 20s with a string of misdemeanors, and worse, he couldn't tell a Hereford from a hole in the ground. After Dowling had left, Willa read the lines again, written in her grandfather's familiar bold, blocky handwriting. "Willa needs to marry within 30 days or she loses the ranch. Women are meant for birthing babies, not running cattle. Like heck, I'm just going to hand the Circle G over to someone else, old man," she muttered to the empty room and booted up her laptop. "I can run things just as well as you or great-granddad did." Pulling up Google, she typed in professional matchmakers. After a few moments, Willa let out a whoop. "Matrimony, huh? Dr. Lachele," she said to the picture of a grinning, purple-haired woman on the webpage, "you've got yourself a new customer." Willa knew the matchmaker as soon as she saw her waiting at the gate of the Rapid City International Airport. Lachele was small and curvy, and her purple hair and her obviously tailored New York suit made her look a little out of place, but her smile was as warm and friendly as her hug, though she called it a booby bump. "So, this is South Dakota. I could see the mountains when we flew in. Those must be your famous Black Hills. How far away is your ranch? I hope it's not too close. I want to take in some scenery and maybe snap some pictures to show Sam." "We've got about a 45-minute drive," Willa assured her when Dr. Lachele stopped for air, and to think, she'd been worried about an awkward, silent car ride with a stranger. By the time they reached the Circle G, Willa felt like she knew everything there was to know about Lachele. The woman hadn't stopped talking since she'd landed, but instead of being annoyed by the chatter, Willa soaked it all in. It had been so long since she'd been around another female, she'd forgotten how much fun it could be. Mrs. Hollis, her father's part-time housekeeper, didn't count. She didn't speak much, except to give orders. "Ooh," Lachele gasped, jumping out of the truck. "Is this your ranch? It's beautiful." Willa watched her excitement with a smile, retrieving Lachele's wheeled purple suitcase from the bed of the truck. The woman sure did have a thing for purple. "Come on in the house," she offered. Willa was proud of the sprawling single-story home. Glowing pine floors, soft yellow walls, overstuffed leather couches with brightly colored pillows, potted plants and Native American artwork here and there, some of it her great-grandmother's, made the home feel warm and welcoming. It was a little lonely for one person, though. But not for long. She'd have to share it with a husband soon. The nervous butterflies that immediately started up in her belly had Willa straightening her spine. "Let me show you to your room, and then we can get this thing started." Soon, the two of them were settled in the living room with plates of sandwiches and cookies Mrs. Hollis had made up that morning. "I know we spoke some on the phone, but tell me more about why you want to get married so quickly and in such a non-traditional way, Dr." Lachele asked after wiping a chocolate chip smudge from the corner of her mouth and leaning back with a contented sigh. "Don't you have lots of cute cowboys out here to choose from?" Willa smiled wryly. "That's exactly what I don't want. A cowboy." She explained the terms of her grandfather's will. "Literally the only thing I'm interested in is a man who knows nothing about ranching and won't try to take my place here." Lachele frowned. "I'm not sure I can help you after all, then. I'm not in the business of making mergers, I'm in the business of making marriages. Love, romance, a lifetime commitment. A happily ever after. Don't you have any interest in any of that?" Willa held back the quick no that jumped to her lips and tried to give the question some honest thought. She just knew Dr. Lachele would be able to tell if she wasn't fully truthful, by the searching look the woman was giving her. Lachele was a trained psychologist. Willa spoke slowly. "I'm not opposed to a traditional marriage. I was raised in faith, and I do believe a man and woman can be partners and helpmates, but I don't know if I would be any good at marriage." She jumped to her feet and paced restlessly in front of the big bay window that faced the barns and the hills. "I don't remember my mom. I have few memories of my grandma. My entire life is here." She swept her arm out. "I spend my days on horseback or balancing books or pitching hay, not primping and fussing and being a girl. I don't know how to be girly, much less wifely. I can't cook, I don't own any makeup, and I've never even been around kids. How do I know if I'd like them? When would I have time to raise them? The cattle don't take days off and I couldn't either." Lachele studied Willa's face long enough, her brows drawn together in thought, that Willa began to feel uncomfortable. "Sit down, honey," she finally said kindly, patting the couch beside her. "You may not know what you want, but I think I can find you exactly what you need." The phone only rang twice before Lachele's soft voice sang out, "Hello, handsome. How's my favorite PR guy?" Ryder Pearce chuckled. He sure was going to miss this crazy woman. "Lachele, have you gone and hired another firm? I thought I was your only PR guy." "Well, of course not," she huffed back. "Matrimony only uses the best, and that's Pearce and Lighthouser." "Correction," Ryder said, spinning his office chair around to take in one of his last views of Manhattan. just Lighthouser. Now you're going to have to put up with my partner, Jerry. He bought me out today, and I'm bound for greener pastures. Congratulations, Ryder. I hope you got lots of money. What are you going to do now? Ryder laughed. Lachele was beyond outspoken, and she never failed to crack him up. Yes, I did, and I don't know. I might start up another company, but I haven't decided. I'm thinking about leaving New York and heading out west somewhere. Oh, really? Lachele's voice perked up considerably. Why is that? I'm ready for an adventure, Ryder said, turning back to his desk and kicking up his Converse-clad feet. I've been tied down with business far too long, and I'm ready for something new. Something different. Did I ever tell you that my great-great-grandpa was a gunslinger? Family legend has it that he once had a shootout with Wild Bill Hickok, and they both walked away unharmed. Turns out, a mean old rooster ran into the road and distracted them both, just as they drew, and both of them fired at it by accident. One of the saloon girls sashayed out in a frilly red dress, picked it up, and hauled it back in to cook for dinner while my great-great-grandpa and Wild Bill rolled around in the street, laughing like loons. Who knows if it's true, but they supposedly ended up sharing 2 plates of tough chicken and fluffy dumplings, and afterward, Grandpappy married the saloon girl, hung up his guns, bought 50 acres and some horses, and lived happily ever after. So, you're going to be a gunslinger? Lachele asked when she could catch her breath from laughing. Ha, and no. Ryder grinned into the phone. But I want to go poke around and maybe see how deep my western roots run. Says the boy born and bred in New York, she replied with an exaggerated East Coast accent. But you're serious about this, I can tell. Have you been dating anyone lately? I knew you'd get around to that, Ryder said, shaking his head and smiling wryly. You've been wanting to match me up for years. But matrimony had been on his mind a lot lately. Selling his business had freed up so much time, he would finally be able to start a family. To him, that sounded like the ultimate adventure. If only it didn't involve dating. Ryder shuddered. He still had emotional scars from when Jerry had tried to set him up with his giggly cousin, Belinda, and then there was the gum-chewer cousin, Bernadette. And before that, the eyelash-batting cousin, Beatrice. He'd thought that one was going to take flight at any moment. Ryder really wanted to leave town before Jerry could dig up any other single female cousins. If there was a way I could get the best of both worlds, he mused out loud, I would really consider it. I trust you more than I trust Jerry and his cousins. Dr. Lachele had an amazing track record with matching couples. He'd done enough PR for her to come to admire the crazy, purple-haired woman's skills in marriage making. She even had a whole wall of baby photos, a really cute collection of what she called her matrimony munchkins. Ryder, Lachele asked sweetly, what are you doing next weekend? Ryder tugged at his tie nervously and looked around the little church. It was exactly what he'd always pictured an Old West church would look like. The long, narrow chapel had tall stained-glass windows, rough-hewn beams overhead, and hand-carved woodwork everywhere. Near the altar, the friendly man who had introduced himself as Pastor Hyland was checking his watch again. It figured, Ryder thought. He finally made up his mind to become a married man, and the bride wasn't even going to show up. Dr. Lachele bustled over to where Ryder waited and straightened the tie he'd tugged out of place. Don't worry, she said. Your beautiful bride will be here any minute. I just called her on her cell, and she's on her way. Can't you tell me anything about her? Ryder asked impatiently, tugging his tie loose again. This is so weird. I'm getting married, and I don't even know her name. You don't need to know her name yet. You just need to know that you two are a perfect match. I haven't been wrong yet, and trust me, this gal's going to knock your socks off. Remember, I interviewed her just as long as I interviewed you, and I guarantee you, this marriage will be all the adventure you could want. Ryder glanced nervously around the nearly empty church. He hoped his socks would be knocked off in a good way, but at least if he passed out, there wouldn't be many witnesses. At the end of the hallway, the double doors opened, and Ryder's tie suddenly felt much tighter again. A tall, beautiful woman in tight jeans, a neat checkered shirt, a wide-brimmed hat, and cowboy boots stood there. Lachele bustled over to her. Good gravy, girl. You should have told me you needed help getting dressed. It's bad luck for the bride and groom to see each other before the wedding. Willa smiled at her. She felt like she and Lachele had almost become friends during Lachele's stay at the ranch, and Willa was glad to see her again. It was hard not to feel close to someone when the person spent almost 8 hours peppering you with personal questions. I am dressed for the wedding, Willa said. Clean shirt and everything. Lachele's eyes widened. You don't have a dress? Well, I do, but I literally haven't worn a dress since I was 5 years old, and I don't know. Willa thought Lachele couldn't look more surprised, but her jaw dropped at that. Seriously? She hooked her arm with Willa's and steered her out the door before Willa could even get a glimpse of her groom. Well, then, today's the perfect day to break that long drought. Now, let's get to it. We don't want to keep your future husband waiting. Less than 15 minutes later, Willa, feeling like a fish out of water in her mother's beautiful white wedding gown, was led back to the sanctuary of the little church. Willa tried to sneak a glance around Lachele to get a glimpse of her groom, but Lachele's husband, Sam, was in the way. He introduced himself and shook her hand carefully, his big paw almost dwarfing hers. Would you like some help down the aisle? Sam asked, his eyes crinkling at the corners in a friendly grin. No, thank you, sir, Willa replied, hoping she didn't sound rude. I can get myself down there. Sam nodded and gave her a wink, sitting back down in the pew next to Pastor Hyland's wife, Patty, who was beaming at her, sniffling, and already had a wadded-up tissue clutched in her fist. Ryder was trying to catch a glimpse of his bride, too, and finally, Sam and Lachele moved aside. He swallowed hard, feeling the impact of her like a punch in the gut. Without the hat, he could see her gleaming black hair, caught up in a simple braid that draped over one shoulder. She had golden, sun-kissed skin that contrasted dramatically with the demure white dress she wore, and dark eyes that looked nearly black. When she started toward him with a long, rangy stride that sent her long skirt swishing, he couldn't help sending up a quick prayer of thanksgiving that this incredible beauty was about to be his. Thank you, God. Willa squared her shoulders as she walked down the aisle. She hardly noticed Patty Hyland jump up and scramble over to the old pipe organ. A belated, slightly off-key rendition of the wedding march boomed out. She tried to ignore the butterflies in her stomach that set flight at the sight of the man waiting for her at the altar. He was taller than her, the one thing Willa had finally asked Lachele for, appearance-wise, with tousled brown hair and eyes the most intense shade of blue she had ever seen. No, that wasn't true, she thought as she got closer. She'd seen that same shade of blue in the summer sky sometimes, early in the morning. Watching her come towards him, the side of his mouth quirked up in a grin, and there was a deep dimple in his left cheek. His good looks were intimidating until her eyes skimmed down his neat dark suit. To find a black and white pair of Converse sneakers on his feet. Unwillingly, a smile tugged at her mouth, too. She twitched back the hem of her dress so he could see that she still wore her cowboy boots, and he laughed deeply, the joyful sound easing her tension completely. Willa, if you'd just take your place here, Pastor Hyland said, drawing her closer to the man she was about to marry, we can get started. Dearly beloved, in what seemed like no time, her groom was sliding a gorgeous diamond solitaire ring on her finger, and Pastor Hyland was wrapping things up. You may kiss the bride. He smiled at the groom, gesturing toward Willa. Glad to, her stranger husband said. His voice was warm and deep, and Willa's butterflies came back with a vengeance. She'd never so much as kissed a man, and now, she was going to be kissed by a husband. His hands went to her waist, and Willa stood awkwardly still, staring up at him. Ready for an adventure? He asked softly, and bent his head to brush his lips against hers, just once but oh so sweetly, while her toes curled in her boots. Sam and Dr. Lachele clapped and whistled, and Mrs. Hyland sobbed loudly. The next few minutes were a blur of congratulations, happy hugs given, and photos snapped by near strangers. Lachele and her husband invited the newlyweds out to lunch, but Willa said no. There were things to be done at the ranch. She had already darted into the ladies' room and changed gratefully back into jeans and her button-down shirt. Pastor and Mrs. Hyland waved them off happily, inviting them back one Sunday for services, which Willa automatically started to decline, and her new husband, oh, Lord, what had his name been? Accepted for both of them. Chapter 2. Ryder could feel his smile stretching from ear to ear. He couldn't believe it. He was standing on a quiet street in South Dakota, in an honest-to-goodness old west town, in front of a pioneer church, with a beautiful cowgirl bride. When Dr. Lachele came in for one last hug, he caught her up in a grateful squeeze that lifted her off her feet and made her shriek. "Put me down," she yelled, whacking him on the shoulder with her purse as Sam just watched on with a smile. Before Ryder could set her back on her feet, Lachele whispered to him, "Be careful with her. Careful and patient, and call me if you need any help." Ryder nodded but brushed off the words. The wedding nervousness. That was the hard part, and it was all over. Now the fun stuff could begin. He turned to look for Willa, but she was already striding toward a dusty F-350 Super Duty truck, those long legs of hers eating up the ground. "Hey," he called out, jogging to catch up. "Are you forgetting something? Hop in." Willa did so herself. Ryder narrowed his eyes. His new bride acted more like she'd just gone grocery shopping and picked up a gallon of milk than a woman who had said her vows with a man she'd never met. But he grabbed his 2 suitcases out of the back of the rental car and tossed them in the bed of the pickup. He could always come back for the rental later. "Where are we going?" Ryder asked once he'd buckled his seatbelt and she'd started the big engine with a roar. She looked over at him uncertainly, her hands tightening on the steering wheel for a moment. "I've got work to do. I thought we'd head home." Ryder cocked his head. "Don't you think we should at least grab some lunch? Have a conversation? I don't even know where home is. Do we live here in Deadwood?" "No," Willa sighed. He was right. She couldn't just go home and pretend everything was normal. She had to actually talk to her new husband. Feed him, and she sure didn't know how to make him lunch. She had to try not to think about wedding nights. "You're right. We'll grab some food first, and, this is awful, but I have a question for you." Willa could feel her cheeks burning, but it would only be worse later if she didn't get this out of the way now. "Ask me anything." Her new husband grinned, dimples winking. Caught up in his handsomeness for a moment, Willa almost didn't answer. "Ah, your name." "I'm sorry," she said miserably. "The wedding happened so fast, and I just didn't catch it." He laughed, showing straight white teeth. "That's okay. The whole situation is a little out of the norm. My name is Ryder. Ryder Pearce." "And you're Willa Pearce." Willa's jaw dropped for a second. She wasn't a Griffin anymore. Shaking her head at the unreality of it all, she said, "I have another question, but this one is easier. Do you like steak?" As Willa drove them to the Gem Steakhouse, Ryder couldn't help but stare out the window like a little kid. Deadwood, South Dakota, was incredible. Buildings that didn't look any different than they probably had in 1875 lined up next to each other on a brick road, sporting names like Hickox, the Bullock Hotel and the Tin Lizzie Gaming Resort, their tall fronts stretching up on either side of Main Street. Awnings shaded the tourists wandering the sidewalks, and hills full of scrubby pines made up the movie-like backdrop. The Mineral Palace, a hotel that apparently housed a casino, a bar, and the Gem Steakhouse, wasn't far. When Ryder jumped out of the truck, the windows above the storefront across the street caught his eye, and he burst out laughing. When Willa looked at him, one dark eyebrow raised in question, he pointed, and she smiled. "I hardly even notice those ladies anymore," she said. "How could you not?" Ryder replied. "They're a little, eye-catching." "Maybe for a man," Willa said, rolling her eyes. In each of the windows, a female mannequin in scanty lingerie had been posed to look down on the streets below, just like the real-life soiled doves probably had over 100 years ago, calling out to the fellas that wandered by on their way to the bars or gambling dens. Ryder imagined they would look creepy at night, but for now, their seedy charm just added to the feel he was getting for a town proud of its rough-and-tumble past. When Willa started to walk ahead of him with her characteristic long steps, Ryder moved quickly and grabbed her hand. You think we could walk together? He asked, holding her smaller, calloused hand in his own. Willa ducked her head a little in embarrassment but slowed her steps to match his. She felt like an idiot and hoped her palm didn't start sweating. She'd never held a man's hand before. She wished she'd have asked Dr. Lachele or even Mrs. Hollis for advice about this whole marriage thing. She hadn't been thinking any further than finding a man, any man, to share space with her on a marriage certificate. Put her on a horse in the middle of 100 nervous steers in a thunderstorm, and she was fine. Hold a man's hand? She had no idea what to do. Ryder seemed to understand her nervousness, though. He let go of her hand long enough to hold the door of the restaurant open, but as she went to walk through, he caught her up in his free arm and gave her a quick but very hot kiss. Relax, he said. We're just going to have lunch and get to know each other. Oddly, it did make her feel better. They were seated quickly and given their drinks and a chance to order, which was easy because both wanted steak and a baked potato. See? Common ground already, said Ryder. I could eat steak and potatoes every day. So, tell me about yourself, Willa Pearce. Oh, you go first. My life story isn't that exciting. Where are you from? Maybe this would be easier if she just kept him talking. New York, Ryder replied. I was born in Vermont but lived in New York most of my life. Ever been to the East Coast? No, I've never been out of the state. Really? Ryder seemed astounded. We'll have to do some traveling. Her heart sank a little. Travel? She couldn't do that. Willa was saved from having to answer him when the waitress brought their food. She was about to cut into her ribeye, to keep her hands busy, when Ryder reached across the table to hold them. He bowed his head, and she quickly did the same. Father, thank you for the food you provided, and thank you for bringing this beautiful woman into my life. Amen. He prayed simply and unself-consciously, and her cheeks heated in a blush again at him calling her beautiful. He squeezed her hands briefly before letting them go. I hope you don't mind, I should have asked first. My parents raised me to give thanks for the good things in my life. No, not at all, Willa assured him and cut into her steak. She liked that her new husband was a Christian. Are your parents still living? They are, he said. Retired doctors, both of them, and Florida snowbirds from September to May. I asked them to the wedding, but both of their calendars are booked out so far in advance, they couldn't free up any time. Really? Willa asked. Not even for your wedding? But Ryder just smiled. They made me promise to bring you down to meet them. You'd have to use a crowbar to pry them away from their beachfront community after September 1st. What about you? What's your family like? It's just me, now. I was an only child. My mom died a few hours after I was born, and my dad left me for my grandparents to raise. My grandma died when I was 5, so it was just me and my grandfather for most of my life, and he passed away a few weeks ago. Ryder's blue eyes clouded with sympathy, and he reached across the table to touch her hand again. I'm sorry, he said simply, and she could tell he was sincere. He was just such a nice man. Her heart squeezed, and she almost embarrassed herself by tearing up. How's your steak? She asked, changing the subject and looking quickly down at her own. That banner in front of the restaurant didn't lie. It's the best steak I've ever had. He popped another bite of the porterhouse in his mouth and closed his eyes briefly in bliss as he chewed. Willa chuckled. Of course, it is. It's one of ours. What do you mean? The Circle G, my ranch, supplies the Gem and a lot of the other restaurants in town with their Black Angus beef. Seriously? Ryder asked. A ranch. Like a real ranch with cowboys? Tell me you can teach me how to ride a horse, and do you have a bunkhouse and a cook named Beans? His face had lit up like she'd just told him she was a millionaire. Willa wanted to laugh at his boyish enthusiasm, but she also didn't want to hurt his feelings. He was definitely a city slicker, from New York, no less, and she knew he was picturing all the romanticized westerns he'd ever seen. Real life, though, was not a Hollywood movie set, as he'd find out when it came time to castrate the calves. Not exactly, she said instead. Ryder threw down his napkin. Are you done? He eyed her empty plate. I mean, we could get dessert. What happened to getting to know each other, she teased. I thought maybe I'd show you around town. Later, he said, already waving for the check. I cannot believe I'm going to be a rancher. Willa's own good humor dimmed fast. Ryder was not going to be a rancher, and he'd need to get that idea right out of his head. It was hard to hold on to her irritation, though, in the face of his obvious excitement. They didn't go straight home. Ryder insisted on a quick stop at Calamity's Western shop. You do not need an entire Western wardrobe, Willa said in exasperation. These stores are for tourists or fancy wear. Tractor Supply carries stuff that will work just fine, and it's a lot cheaper. You are not going to wear sequins and rhinestones. Come on, Ryder said, quirking a grin at her and holding up a bright red shirt with mother-of-pearl buttons and silver embroidery. He would look cute in anything he wore, she had to admit to herself, but he was also going to look like the biggest greenhorn ever if she let him get away with this. No, you'll look like a square dance collar, she said firmly, taking the hanger from him and putting the shirt back. Grabbing him by the elbow, she pulled him out of the store. After 6 months, if you still want the shirt, you can come back and get it. At Tractor Supply, she helped him pick out some sturdy work boots, no pointy toes or alligator skin, Levi's, t-shirts, long-sleeved Henleys, thermal wear, and flannel shirts. Daytime temperatures were still in the 70s, but they dropped fast in October. They also bought warm socks, a Carhartt jacket, and warm gloves. By the time they finished, Willa was eyeing her watch. She hated shopping, and she'd already been away from the Circle G for going on 6 hours. Ryder was studying a selection of hats when he began to get the feeling that his wife was tired of waiting for him. He wasn't normally a clothes horse or anything, but this was all just so cool and different to him. Even the store itself smelled weird, like animal food and sawdust, and he wanted to take it all in. If a feed store could be this much fun, how much fun would the rest of his new life be? Lachele had really known what she was doing when she'd matched him up with Willa. Speaking of his bride, her arms were crossed, and she was looking more and more impatient by the minute. And he abruptly found it very sexy. He had a wife. To have and to hold was going to be a reality, finally. And he definitely couldn't wait to get his hands on her so they could do some having and holding. She caught him watching her and frowned. Just get this one, she said, grabbing a Sioux Falls Canaries orange and blue baseball hat and plunking it on his head. I don't know, he said doubtfully. Doesn't look like yours. I earned mine, Willa said abruptly, at the end of her patience. Last 6 months, and I'll buy you a good hat, too. Her irritation didn't faze him. Heedless of the fact that they were in the middle of a store, Ryder pulled her close and tipped his hat back. He kissed her, feeling the stiffness in the slim body pressed up against his go lax and loose in surprise. It only lasted a moment, but when he finally let her go, her dark eyes looked dazed and a little blurry. But she looked a lot less irritated. Ah. Are you ready? She finally asked, and he just gave her a knowing grin. They made their way to the checkout with the brimming cart, and the young girl behind the register gave him a funny look. Willa almost laughed out loud when she realized that Ryder was still wearing the suit they'd gotten married in, complete with the Converse shoes and the tipped-back baseball hat. She couldn't imagine what anyone would think, seeing him here. Even as she snagged his hat and put it on the counter so the girl could ring it up, he was wandering over to a display of books. Look, Ryder said, holding one up. Raising Beef for Dummies. I already know how to do that, Willa said, folding her arms. He wasn't deterred. He grabbed several different books, seemingly at random, and dumped them on the counter with the clothes. As an afterthought, he grabbed a handful of cow tails, a long, chewy caramel taffy, and dropped them on the pile. Giving her what she'd come to realize was his trademark, winning smile, he asked, Do you want anything? Willa just sighed and grabbed 2 more cow tails. She'd only been married a few hours, but having a husband so far seemed about like having a teenage boy. The Circle G was about 45 minutes from Deadwood, and Ryder divided his time between peppering her with questions about ranch operations and vaccinations and grazing techniques, and reading out of the books he'd bought. She gave him sidelong glances as she drove, noticing the way that his hair fell over his forehead, his strong profile, the line of his jaw, just a little bristled with stubble. Willa was glad he was so obviously interested in his book, this one a history of South Dakota, that it gave her time to think and worry in peace. She actually hadn't told anyone she was getting married. It didn't matter to the ranch hands, since to them, she was mostly just a fellow worker that happened to sign their paychecks, but she was starting to think she should have at least said something to Mrs. Hollis. Or Brody. It was really starting to hit home that she hadn't just signed a contract. She'd changed her entire life with a few words and the stroke of a pen. Ryder looked like he was reading, but he hadn't turned a page in the last 10 miles. He was conscious of Willa watching him. It was getting late in the afternoon, and he couldn't help it, his mind was going to what would happen that night. His first time as a married man. In fact, his first time ever. He wasn't completely sure, but based on her blushes, he thought that the same went for the delectable Willa. He looked at her out of the corner of his eye, her back straight, eyes alert on the country road ahead of them, and wondered if she was thinking about it, too. There was a good, healthy spark of lust between them, and there was no mistaking the way their kisses had affected her. He wasn't nervous about the sex. He figured that God intended for it to be fun for both parties, and it was a natural thing, meant to be enjoyed. He was just nervous that he wouldn't be able to go slow. He wanted to eat her up like a piece of candy. His jeans felt tighter just thinking about that long, slim body and what might be hidden under denim and cotton. It didn't help matters when she spoke, her low, honeyed voice saying something as her full pink lips moved. Ryder wanted to hear his name on those lips. And then they were slowing down to make a turn, and she glanced at him. "Are you okay?" "Sorry, I didn't hear you. What did you say?" He could feel his face heat. "I said, we're here. This is the Circle G." He looked, and sure enough, there was a simple black metal arch over a dusty 2-track, with a stylized G inside a hoop in the middle. He didn't see a house or any cows, though. Just long stretches on both sides of 4-strand barbed wire fencing and rolling hills of still mostly green grass. They drove on, bouncing over ruts, for about a quarter of a mile, and on the next rise, he could see a low, white house that sprawled over a hilltop and a few barns and outbuildings scattered here and there, ranging in size. Ryder looked at Willa, and he could see the pride in her face as she waited for his reaction. "You own all this?" he asked. "This place is incredible." She smiled shyly at him, and he finally understood the cheesy phrase. He could have sworn his heart skipped a beat. "It is pretty great," she agreed. "If you look over there," she nodded her head, "you can see Mount Rushmore." "No kidding." He whistled. He couldn't make out the faces, but it was true. There was a view of Mount Rushmore from her backyard. The feeling of stepping onto a movie set persisted. Willa parked the truck in front of the house and waited near the front door for Ryder to grab his things. She wanted to curse when she saw Brody riding toward them on one of the piebald geldings. She wasn't ready to introduce them yet. Brody wouldn't appreciate that she hadn't told him about matrimony, and he tended to be overprotective of her. Once, he'd decked one of the ranch hands for making a flirtatious comment to her. Being around men as she had all her life, Willa had brushed it off as boys being boys, but Brody had considered the man way out of bounds. He'd gone to her grandfather afterward, and the cowboy had packed his things and moved on by the next day. "Hey, Will," he called out, bringing the horse to a stop and looking curiously at Ryder in his suit and sneakers. "Who's this?" Ryder studied the other man, feeling just a little bit insecure. He was perched on top of the black and white horse like he'd been born there, tall and tan, and not much older than Ryder. He was good-looking, as far as Ryder could tell, with a face that the ladies probably liked, sort of a cross between Matt Damon and the guy that played Thor in those superhero movies. He reached a hand down to Ryder, and his grip was firm and hard. Maybe a little too hard? Ryder narrowed his eyes and looked over to see Willa's reaction. Her cheeks were dusty pink under her light brown skin. She cleared her throat and gave the man on the horse a careful look. Brody, meet Ryder. He's. Ryder and I got married this morning. The guy looked shell-shocked, his eyes wide. Ryder nodded his head. Nice to meet you, Brody. Brody nodded back curtly but didn't say anything for a full 30 seconds. He studied Ryder again, harder this time. What have you done, Willa? He finally ground out. Willa wasn't cowed by his overbearing tone. She drew back her shoulders and glared at Brody. I've gotten married. This is about the ranch, isn't it? About Richard and the will, Brody, she shot back in a warning tone. This decision wasn't up to you. I'm taking Ryder in to show him around. If you want to talk about this later, fine, but right now, I want you to get a couple of men out there with you to move the herd. The back pasture is looking overgrazed. Ryder winced. He didn't appreciate the guy's tone, and he wasn't completely sure he wasn't jealous of his obviously close relationship to Willa, but she'd just told him to butt out and that he wasn't doing his job right. That had to sting. Sure enough, Brody gave Ryder one last threatening look, wheeled the horse around without even using the reins, and headed off without a word. Willa grabbed the tractor supply bags and stomped toward the house, and Ryder found himself following her. Again. He mused over the situation. His new bride had some splaining to do. Chapter 3. Willa stalked through the entryway almost unseeingly into the living room, dropping the bags she carried on the couch. That had gone just about as bad as could be expected. Her stomach ached dully. She knew Brody well enough to know that he was hurt by the fact that she hadn't told him she was getting married. He'd been her friend forever, and he didn't deserve that kind of treatment. When she heard a thump behind her, she spun around, startled. You forgot your husband again. Ryder wasn't smiling his usual, easygoing smile. He was just eyeing her, a serious expression on his face. No dimples. I think we need to have a talk. If there was one thing Willa hated, it was talking. I've got some things to do, she said, giving him a little distance as she sidled around him to head for the door. Nah, wife. I think this is important. What did he mean about the will? Willa just wanted to escape, but judging by the look in Ryder's eyes, he wasn't having that. She backtracked and headed for a couch instead. Might as well get all of the unpleasantness over at once. Like a band-aid, my grandfather stipulated in his will that if I didn't marry in 30 days, I would forfeit the Circle G. Ryder sank down on the couch opposite her, where Lachele had sat just a couple weeks before, his hands dangling over his knees. Were you going to tell me this? He asked seriously. Or were you just going to let me think that you'd decided to use a matchmaker on a whim? She bristled. I was going to tell you. It's not like we've had a lot of time together. Well, you could have brought it up at lunch when we were talking about your grandpa. So, do you intend for this to be a business relationship? Because if I'd wanted that, I'd have stayed in New York. No, Willa said uncertainly, jumping up to pace across the Navajo-patterned rug. I don't know. I just needed to get married, is all, and this was the quickest way I could do it. What about kids? I told Lachele I wanted kids. She crossed her arms over her chest. I want them, too. Just maybe not right away. And how is this supposed to work? Ryder asked relentlessly. Am I just supposed to stay here, twiddling my thumbs as you go about your ranching? Am I just supposed to be a convenience for you? Marriage is a two-way street. What about the physical aspects of this relationship? Were you just planning on some platonic thing? Her stomach ached even harder. His blue eyes looked so disappointed, and she hated to feel like she was a disappointment. I don't know. We'll work this out. You weren't what I expected. It was true. Ryder was nice, had a great sense of humor, and just brimmed over with fun. You didn't have to be around him for 5 minutes before that became obvious. She liked him. If she had to spend the rest of her life with one person, he certainly wouldn't be boring. To her horror, she felt tears burning the back of her eyes. Ryder watched her carefully. Willa's eyes glistened as if she was ready to cry at any second, and he didn't want that. She seemed so sturdy. Her backbone was so rigid that he felt like she might break if he wasn't cautious. "Fine," he said softly. "Go do what you have to do." He waved a hand at the big screen TV mounted over the stone fireplace at the side of the room. "It's Saturday. Maybe I'll catch some college football or something." She nodded gratefully and meant to walk past him, but he grabbed her hand and pulled her down on his lap. "I want a real marriage," he said, his voice husky as he toyed with the silky end of her braid, where it hung over her breast. "I think, deep down, you do, too." Willa was caught up in his eyes, almost afraid to move. Her body felt like it was humming, warming wherever he touched her. "I like you," Ryder said. "And I think we could make something really good together." He ran a thumb over her bottom lip, and it tingled. He followed his thumb with his mouth, and the breath caught in the back of her throat. His lips were warm and firm, and it felt like his hand was searing through her shirt where it rested lightly at her back. He kissed her slowly, searchingly, like they had all the time in the world, but it seemed to end too quickly. Ryder gave the end of her braid a last playful tug, and she stood, her knees a little wobbly. "Something to think about," he said, grinning a little. Shaken, Willa escaped as fast as she could. Ryder changed into jeans and a t-shirt and explored the house a little after Willa had left. It seemed to stretch for acres. He counted 4 bathrooms, 6 bedrooms, a kitchen big enough to feed an army with 2 gas stoves, a laundry room, a living room, a game room, a professional-looking office, and a library. The Circle G was apparently a prosperous spread. He found the room that must be Willa's and, resolutely, unpacked his bags. His wife apparently had little interest in clothes, the dresser was only half full, and the closet had plenty of room for his things. He resisted looking in her drawers, but he was curious. Were her underthings as practical and no-nonsense as the rest of her clothes? He hadn't seen a single dress except for the wedding gown that he hung up for her in the back of the closet. Looking to see for sure, though, would have made him a peeping Tom. It was getting close to 8, and the sun had set nearly a half-hour ago in a technicolor burst of vivid oranges and blues that he'd watched from a big, west-facing bay window. His stomach was rumbling, and he wasn't sure how much longer Willa would be, so he headed toward the kitchen at the back of the house to forage for himself. He was bent over, searching the fridge, when a door opened. Seconds later, a shrill, feminine shriek split the air, and something hit him hard in the back. "Hey," he yelled, swinging around. His reflexes were quick. He ducked a can of green beans just in time and squeezed behind the partially open refrigerator door. "Don't fire, I surrender." Across the kitchen, the screaming intruder held up a can of corn threateningly. "You just stay right there," she boomed in a voice that was much deeper than he would have guessed a minute ago. "What are you doing in Willa's kitchen?" "I'm her husband." "Ryder." He held his hands up in what he hoped looked like a non-threatening way, but the older woman scowled and only hoisted the corn up higher. She had a seamed, leathery face, a bright pink sweatshirt with sequin-accented kittens on it, and a head full of tightly permed white curls that marched in precision down the back and sides in perfect formation. She looked like what his mother would refer to as an old battle axe. "You're a liar. Willa's not married." He held up one hand with the plain gold band on it that Willa had placed there what felt like years ago, but had only been this morning. "I swear to you. We just got married. And please, put the corn down. I don't think she'd appreciate it if you killed me before we even got around to a honeymoon." His brain scrambled for a way to convince her that he wasn't a threat, and the words started tumbling out. She had to get married. Her grandfather died a few weeks ago. He put in his will that she'd lose the place if she didn't marry in a month. "That's why I'm here. We were matched up through a marriage service in New York, matrimony." "You must be Mrs. Hollis? The housekeeper?" The suspicious look didn't leave her face, but her lips pursed, and she set the can down carefully on the countertop in front of her. Ryder resisted the urge to rub what was probably a burgeoning bruise on his lower back. The woman had an arm on her, for sure. He eased out from behind the refrigerator door and closed it behind him. "Truce?" he asked, holding out his hand and giving her his winningest grin, the one that had landed him some of the most difficult customers of his public relations career. Mrs. Hollis sniffed, unimpressed. "I suppose." She shook his hand gingerly and went back to unloading grocery bags, as if the whole crazy interlude had never happened. "There's more of these in my car," she ordered. "The trunk isn't going to unload itself." Ryder shook his head in amusement. "Yes, ma'am," he said, padding barefoot out the back door to unload the groceries. Willa rubbed her aching lower back and called herself 10 kinds of a coward. It was nearly 9, and she'd been hiding out in the back of the barn that housed a small flock of goats, mucking out the pens. The goats were only there because her grandfather, in an uncharacteristically whimsical mood a few years before, had decided to buy a few after he watched some funny videos on YouTube. She didn't mind them. They were Nubians, with long, soft ears and mostly docile personalities, but overall, she usually avoided the chores that went along with the goat barn. Her motives now weren't pure, though. She was avoiding Brody, avoiding Ryder, and avoiding thinking about marriage or anything, really, except the monotony of lifting one shovel full of dirty, stinky straw after another into a wheelbarrow. As a result, she was exhausted and dirty, and probably smelled like poo. And she would be up again tomorrow at 5, as usual. She plodded toward the house in the dark, through night air that carried just a nip of the colder temperatures to come, with a million stars spread out overhead. She didn't even notice, though, too caught up in the guilt that swamped her when she pictured Ryder sitting in the big house by himself all evening, probably with his nose buried in one of the books that he'd bought. Sneaking in through the back door was just one more cowardly act, especially when Ryder was probably already in bed, but she did it anyway. She toed off her filthy boots in the mudroom and opened the kitchen door, completely unprepared for the sight of her new husband and her taciturn housekeeper engaged in a rowdy game of poker at the kitchen table. Country music blared out of the small countertop radio, and the two of them had tall glasses of iced tea and enough snacks scattered around that it looked like they must have been at it for a while. Ryder barely looked up from his hand. "Hey, Willa. Want to join us? Mrs. Hollis is beating the pants off me. She's won all of my peanuts, and I owe her about 7,385 MNMS. There's a bowl of chili in the refrigerator," Mrs. Hollis said shortly. "Are you going to play, young man, or sit there jawing?" I'm just going to take a shower," Willa said. "I'm not very hungry." "You look tired," her brand new husband said, laying a card down on the table to Mrs. Hollis's triumphant hoot and not even looking up to see that Willa did, in fact, look tired. "Why don't you go to bed? I'll see you tomorrow." Feeling completely knocked off kilter, Willa headed toward the other end of the house. She showered, scrubbing her hair and thinking about how strange Ryder was. He acted like he wasn't even expecting anything on this. Their wedding night. Her irritation grew as she pulled on some sweatpants and a t-shirt, brushing her teeth with more force than necessary. All of the worrying she'd done. For nothing? He was too busy whooping it up with her elderly housekeeper, who had never asked Willa to play cards in all the years that she'd worked for the Griffins. She threw herself into bed, forgetting to set her alarm. This was unbelievable. Willa had stewed for who knew how long, finally falling into a restless sleep, only to be jolted awake when she felt the mattress bounce. "Sorry," came Ryder's voice softly. "I'm not used to nighttime being pitch dark." "What are you doing?" Willa asked, clutching the blankets to her chest. Was this it? Were they going to consummate things now? She lay stiffly as he settled in on the other side of her. "Going to bed," Ryder said. "Good night. Sweet dreams." She didn't relax, even after his breathing evened out in sleep. She'd never had anyone sleep next to her, and she didn't think she'd get a wink of rest all night. She must have, though, because she woke up the next morning with one leg thrown over Ryder, her head pillowed on his hard chest. The sun shone brightly through a gap in the curtain, illuminating his pectoral muscles, firm and sculpted and lightly dusted with light brown hair. It felt soft and crinkly beneath her cheek. Her eyes widened abruptly. Sunday bright. It was morning. And she'd overslept. And she had wrapped herself around Ryder sometime during the night. Easing away as quickly as she could, she jumped out of bed and hurried to the dresser, rummaging around for some clean clothes. I honestly never knew how sexy sweatpants were until now. She spun around to find him watching her, his arms folded behind his head, his blue eyes sleepy, and an easy grin on his face. She couldn't help it. She blushed. Willa hadn't blushed as often as she had in the last 2 days since. Ever. "Good morning," she blurted. "I'm late." His laugh followed her into the bathroom. She was gulping down a hasty cup of coffee in the kitchen, tucking in the tails of her long-sleeved flannel shirt, when Ryder patted in. He had loose pajama bottoms on, but nothing else. His feet and his torso were bare. "Any of that left?" He nodded at her mug. "Yes, help yourself." She took a quick bite of her peanut butter, slathered English muffin and bent to pull on a pair of socks. Why was she embarrassed to have naked feet in front of him? It wasn't like he wouldn't see all of her eventually. "What are you doing today?" he asked curiously, sitting down across from her at the table, the signs of last night's impromptu card party having been cleaned up sometime earlier. Willa started, suddenly unable to remember. She couldn't look away from him. Ryder's arms were as nicely muscled as his chest. He sure wasn't built like she imagined a big city businessman would be. "Fences. I'm checking fences today." "Do you do that on horseback?" "Sometimes. We also have ATVs that we use. Riding the perimeter and making sure the fencing doesn't need repair is a pretty regular thing." "That's so cool. You'll have to teach me how to ride one. I would imagine a four-wheeler would be a lot easier to manage than a horse." She was about to respond when, on the counter, her two-way handset crackled from its charger. "Willa, do you read?" She crossed over to the counter and picked it up. "Yeah, Harvey. What's up?" Billy cut himself again, working on one of the tractors. September at the ranch meant the men would be filling up some of their time with equipment maintenance, and Billy, the newest hand, always seemed to be cutting himself on something or another. He was only 18 and clumsy as a newborn colt. "I'll be right there." Willa was already grabbing a first aid kit from one of the many that were stashed in locations around the ranch. Mrs. Hollis kept them stocked with everything from band-aids to needles and suturing thread, and there were several more scattered throughout the property. Ranch life was full of unexpected injuries. "You need any help?" Ryder offered. "I'm actually first aid certified." "No. I mean, no thanks. I've stitched up more guys than I can count and Billy the most often. He's used to it." "Hold on," he said, standing up before she could head out the door. "You forgot something again." "What?" Willa asked, confused. "This." Ryder's kiss tasted like warm coffee and hot mail, and he smiled down at her as he pulled away. "Will you be back for lunch?" Normally, Willa didn't eat until dinner, around 4, and especially on days that she was late getting started, but suddenly, she didn't want to wait that long until she saw Ryder again. She smiled back. "I'll be here by 1. "Good," he grinned. "Someone needs to protect me from Mrs. Hollis. She threatened to come back today and beat me at cards all over again. This time with gin rummy." Ryder watched Willa head out the door, her black braid swinging back and forth as she moved. He liked keeping her off balance. He was still a little stunned to find out that Willa's reasons for marriage were somewhat mercenary, but he was up for the challenge of winning her over to his way of thinking. She'd gone her own way for a long time, and it would take some ingenuity on his part to help her see that she didn't have to do things solo, that he could be the partner she didn't know she needed. Lachele may have been right with her advice yesterday after all. "Be careful," she'd said, "careful and patient." Ryder headed out of the kitchen whistling. Chapter 4. Willa wasn't back to the house by 1. She wasn't back by 4:30. She didn't come stumbling through the door, dusty and dirty and in a terrible mood, until almost 8 o'clock that evening. She wasn't in any frame of mind to talk to Ryder, who was sitting at the kitchen table with his arms folded, watching for her as she came in. "Hello, wife," he said coolly, raising one eyebrow as he looked at the long rip in the leg of her jeans, sticking uncomfortably to her shin where blood had dried. She didn't respond, just grabbed one of the ever-present first aid kits and removed some gauze and antiseptic. Ryder wanted to be angry with Willa, especially when she refused to even answer his greeting, but he didn't miss the twinge of pain on her face as she bent over to deal with an angry-looking scratch. She had already had a rough day. "Here," he said, relenting. "Let me do that." He knew she must be exhausted when she didn't even protest, just leaned back in the chair with a long sigh. "What happened to you today?" "I'm sorry I missed lunch, okay," she said shortly, still feeling guilty that she'd broken her promise. Ryder waved that off and dabbed competently at the edges of her cut. "I'm not talking about that. I figured when I didn't see you at lunch that your day didn't go as planned." "How'd you get this?" Willa had to focus on his words. His big hands were smooth and gentle, and she just wanted to enjoy the rare feeling of contact with another person. Especially, she thought with an involuntary shiver, looking down at his bent head, such a good-looking one. "I fell off my horse and caught my leg on the saddle buckle on the way down." It was embarrassing to admit. She'd been on horseback since she was old enough to walk, and falls were rare, but she hadn't been paying attention. "He got spooked by a rabbit. Strained his fetlock a little bit, so we walked back." "Couldn't you call anyone for help?" Willa looked at him, obviously confused. "Why would I do that?" "Why, indeed?" Ryder murmured, fixing a bandage into place. "Do you want something to eat?" he asked, putting the first aid kit back in the cupboard and washing his hands. "There's leftover chili from yesterday." "That sounds great." Willa got up to get the bowls, but Ryder turned her toward the living room with firm hands on her shoulders. "Go. Sit. I'll bring it to you." Feeling awkward at having nothing to do, Willa went. She was settled into the comfy couch, half asleep, when Ryder brought her a steaming bowl of chili, piled high with cheese and sour cream, the way she liked it. He set a glass of iced tea on the coffee table next to her. In a few minutes, he was back with his own bowl, and they settled into a companionable silence while they ate, until he broke it with the dreaded words, "We need to talk." "About what?" Willa asked carefully, taking a sip of the tea. "Sex, among other things." Willa choked on the tea. She waved him away when he tried to get up. "I'm fine," she sputtered. "Just went down the wrong way." Her face burned in embarrassment, and she wanted to kick him when she saw him nod, trying to stifle his grin. "Happens to the best of us," Ryder said soberly. "So, I think we should wait." Wait, wasn't that what they'd been doing? Willa struggled between disappointment and relief. "That's fine," she finally said. Didn't he think she was attractive? She could have sworn by his kisses that he did, not that she had any real experience to go by. Maybe all men kissed like he did. Her belly fluttered just thinking about it. No, she didn't think there could be any man who could kiss like Ryder could. "I'd like to wait until we get to know each other better," Ryder added. "But to do that, we'll need to spend time together." Willa automatically started to protest that she couldn't possibly take time away from everything, but Ryder stopped her. "You came into this marriage with goals in mind. Your goal was to keep this ranch, and you've accomplished that. But I went into marriage with a goal, too, and that was to have a real marriage. I can't have that with a stranger, and I won't sit here all day while the wife of my dreams is just out of my reach, waiting for her to find time to get to know me. I know the ranch is important to you. So, I'll come to you. Starting tomorrow, I'm going to be everywhere you're going to be." 1,000 different reasons that Ryder's idea was a bad one came to mind, but when Willa opened her mouth, the only thing that came out was, "I'm the wife of your dreams?" Instantly, she wanted to take the words back. She had sounded so needy. But Ryder's blue eyes warmed with sincerity, and his lips curved up in a soft smile. "Willa, I'm absolutely certain you're the wife of my dreams. I'm even more certain that I'm the man that God put on this earth exactly for you. Give us a chance to find out for sure, will you?" Her feelings for her new husband were in such an emotional tangle right now, fear and happiness, mixed with some kind of longing she couldn't even put a name to. Willa was afraid that he was right. Unable to speak, she just nodded. Lord help her, she didn't think that she could deny this man anything. Willa thought the early wake-up would throw him off, but Ryder bounced out of bed as soon as the alarm went off at 5. He was dressed in comfortable jeans, his new boots, and a long-sleeved blue shirt that made his eyes look even bluer than they already were, making coffee when she came into the kitchen. The toaster popped behind him, and he quickly spread peanut butter on an English muffin. Sit down, he offered, pouring coffee into a mug. You like these for breakfast, right? He set a plate in front of her. You don't miss anything, do you? Willa asked, shaking her head. Thank you. No problem. Ryder sat down across from her with his own breakfast. What's on the agenda today? I've got to check on Star, and after that, I need to finish writing the fence line in the far pasture. Later on, I'll be doing calf checks, and after that, updated records. She sighed. I hate updating records. You'd rather be outside, huh? You've got it. Being cooped up was not Willa's favorite thing, especially in these last few fleeting days of good weather. Let's get to it, then. Ryder smiled, finishing up his coffee. Consider me your extra pair of hands. She eyed his hands, big and broad and capable, but not even remotely calloused enough to handle the kind of work she did every day. All right. If you're sure, she said in a warning tone. But don't complain to me tonight when every muscle in your body is begging for mercy. Ryder winked. Maybe we can give each other massages. Their first stop was the horse barn. Ryder wasn't sure what he should have expected, but aside from the obvious smell of horse, the place couldn't have been cleaner or more organized. A long row of polished wooden doors stretched down on either side, and each horse had a spacious stall, with his or her name on a gold plaque above the entrance. Sunshine, Lazy Pete, Marigold, Frederick. Each horse stuck his head out to greet them with a welcoming whinny or, in Frederick's case, an attempted nip to the shoulder. Ryder's quick reflexes kept the animal from getting a bite, and he laughed. Tough guy, huh? He asked the big black animal, who watched him with a fiery glint in his dark eyes. Ryder kept a safe distance as the horse peeled back his lips over yellow teeth and gave him a sharp whicker. Careful, Willa said. This bad boy has brought down tougher cowboys than you. He doesn't scare me. It was true. Ryder had never been around horses, but he'd always admired their beauty and intelligence. Horses didn't scare him, but he sure wasn't going near this one until he had some more experience with them. They continued down the hall to the last stall, where a brown and white horse gave an excited noise at the sight of Willa. Hey, boy, she crooned, rubbing her knuckles gently over his nose. How are you feeling today? Does he answer? Ryder asked curiously. Willa laughed as the horse nudged her back a whole step with his huge head. That's how he says hello. He's only a baby like that with Willa. Brody stepped out of the stall behind them. Morning, Willa. Ryder. His nod was friendly, but his tone was cool. Hi, Brody, Willa said. How's it going this morning? Fine. Brody obviously hadn't reached the forgive and forget stage of things yet, Ryder noticed. He pulled out his PR persona and did his best to smooth the breach. Morning, Brody. He grinned and stuck out his hand. The handshake wasn't grudging, but because Brody's hands were covered with dirt, bits of straw, and something kind of sticky, it was a little unpleasant. Ryder met the other man's eyes and didn't wipe his hand on his leg, as much as he wanted to. Brody quirked a reluctant grin, appreciating Ryder's effort. Willa got you out working today? He asked in a friendlier tone. Yep. I wouldn't let her leave me behind this time. Willa huffed, but the tension was broken. You both know I'm standing right here, right? Yes, ma'am, boss lady. Knock it off, Brody. You know I hate it when you call me that. She socked him hard on the shoulder, and his grin came a little easier. If you'll both excuse me, he said, I'm going to wash my hands. Finished preg testing Ramona. He nodded his head toward the stall behind him and smiled at Ryder one last time, a little challengingly, before he walked away, boot heels clicking merrily on the cement floor. Ryder paled, looking down at his own dirty hand. This time, he did wipe it on his jeans as Willa laughed. Ryder figured he could get used to this. The sun had come up in a bursting blaze of pinks and golds as he bounced along the fields in a Super Duty pickup truck behind the one his wife drove. Cattle milled toward them as they loaded the feeders with the bales of hay they carried to supplement the animals' grazing. The air was cool, only in the low 50s, but he easily worked up a sweat, his muscles warming as he loaded and unloaded the back of the truck. It felt good. Willa seemed to work effortlessly, her long, lean frame moving with the grace of a ballet dancer as she swung from one task to the next. It was hard for Ryder to keep his eyes off her. After they'd distributed the feed and deposited the trucks back at the lot, things got even more fun. After a few minutes of instructions, Ryder was blasting around on the back of a four-wheeler. He was a good driver, but on city roads with traffic clogging the lanes all around him, the Black Hills demanded a different set of driving skills, and more than once, a hollow would appear before him, and all four tires would be airborne before the four-wheeler came down with bone-rattling force, spitting dirt behind him as the tires gained traction. "This does not feel like work," he shouted at Willa over the roar of the engines. Even though she wore a helmet, he could swear he felt her roll her eyes at him. "That's because you're not working," she yelled back. "You're supposed to be checking the fence for broken wire." After that, it was a tightrope walk between watching where he was going, being aware of his surroundings, and keeping an eye on the fence line. They stopped 3 times to fix damaged areas, and he gained first-hand knowledge of the need for a million first-aid kits as he took a slice on the knuckle from a loose barb. "See?" Willa nodded as she smacked a huge band-aid on his stinging hand. "Now you're starting to get it. You up to date on your tetanus shot?" "Yes, Mom," he joked. "You going to let me lead the way on the way back?" "I suppose so. It's not like you can get lost following a fence." Willa tried to be exasperated as she watched Ryder hot-dogging on his four-wheeler like a teenager, but she couldn't help but feel a little surprised glow of pride. He'd kept up. She'd expected that having a city slicker like him following her around all day would be nothing but a nuisance, but Ryder took instructions like a champ and worked as hard as any of her ranch hands. He was actually helpful, and boy oh boy was he yummy to look at, she thought, trying not to notice the way his jeans hugged his backside as he lifted his seat to go over a particularly big bump. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to focus her thoughts back on the tasks at hand, only to rattle her own teeth together over the same bump in the trail. Willa tried not to feel abandoned later when it was time to do her hated record-keeping, and she headed back into the main house to get cleaned up. After they'd returned from checking fences and grabbed some of the cheeseburgers Mrs. Hollis was cooking up in the bunkhouse kitchen, Brody and Ryder had apparently bonded over lunch, in that weird way that men had, and decided to be BFFs. Now, her new husband was currently getting his first horseback riding lesson. So, not only was she stuck in the house, Willa thought, trying not to pout, but Ryder wasn't. It wasn't until she'd settled in at the computer in the office that she realized that Brody was teaching Ryder in the paddock directly in view of the office window. She knew she shouldn't have been, but Willa was surprised to see that Ryder was taking to horseback as easily as he'd taken to everything else she'd thrown at him that day. He was sitting straight and perfectly comfortable on the back of Marigold, one of the more docile mares, as Brody sat on the fence, calling out instructions. She forgot all about paperwork as she watched for almost an hour as he went from walking in slow circles around the paddock, to finally cantering. The man looked like he'd been born to ride. She was beaming with pride when she caught her reflection in the blank screen of the computer. What was she thinking? Willa's grin turned to a scowl. She'd already wasted half the afternoon inside and hadn't even booted the darned computer up. That man was nothing but a distraction. A nuisance. A city slicker who didn't have the first idea about the way things worked on a ranch. She couldn't help it. Her eyes drifted up to the window again, and her heart squeezed as she watched Ryder easily dismount, and then laugh as Marigold swung around to nuzzle his shoulder. The horse was obviously infatuated with the man. And, thought Willa with a growing feeling of discomfort, Marigold wasn't the only one with an infatuation. The next morning, the alarm went off again at 5. Willa quickly and awkwardly untangled herself from Ryder, somehow, Despite their brains' desire to wait on physical intimacy, their bodies had their own ideas in the middle of the night, and bounced out of bed like she had springs in her feet. Ryder, however, rolled over and felt every single one of his muscles seize up into painful knots all at once. "I'm dying," he gasped. His bride didn't hear him. She'd already disappeared into the bathroom, and he could hear the shower running. Slowly, carefully, and with much aching and groaning, Ryder levered himself out of bed. His biceps burned, likely from throwing hay. His backside complained of rough treatment on the back of the four-wheeler, and his legs moaned in pain from the unaccustomed exercise of gripping a horse's sides. And to top it off, he had a killer headache. He wanted to lift his hands to his sore temples, but he didn't want to be found sobbing like a baby when Willa came out of her shower. Instead, he shuffled off to the bathroom down the hall like an old man. By the time he made it to the kitchen, Willa had already finished her breakfast and was sitting at the table, eyeing him with some sympathy. At his place at the table was a fragrant cup of coffee and a bottle of pain reliever. Ryder felt a surge of optimism at the evidence of her caring gesture, but it evaporated when she asked kindly, "Do you give up yet?" "You'd like that, wouldn't you?" he growled, lowering himself carefully into the chair across from her. Pride didn't stop him from immediately uncapping the bottle of Tylenol, though, and shaking 4 out into his hand. She shrugged. "You did well yesterday. Better than I thought you would, actually, but there's no shame in admitting when you're beat." "I'm just a little sore," Ryder replied, gulping the pills down with hot coffee and praying for quick, blessed relief. "Let's go." By the time the sky had lightened from black to a chilly leaden gray that promised rain later in the day, Ryder had overcome most of his stiffness and was throwing bales of hay with, if not spectacular skill, at least competence. After they'd finished up the morning's chores, they ran into Brody in the main barn. "Hey, I didn't expect to see you today." The other man laughed, punching Ryder lightly on the arm. Ryder fought back a grimace. "Little achy. No big deal." "Uh-huh," Brody said, smiling. "Well, I was wondering if you wanted a project. Might not be as fun as what Willa's got going on, but it's just as important. I've got a calf who needs to be bottle-fed." "We've got a bottle feeder?" Willa asked. "When did this happen?" "Looks like last night," Brody answered. "One of the cows gave birth to twins and rejected one. It's not looking good," he added, his face serious. "I've got her in one of the pens in the back. She's going to need a lot of care if she makes it through it all." "Are you up for this?" Willa asked Ryder. "It's harder work than it sounds." "Lead the way," Ryder replied, just glad to have something to do that wouldn't involve a four-wheeler. Even playing mommy to a motherless cow sounded better than that. Chapter 5. The struggle between life and death was a battle that never ended in ranch life, and even though she had seen all there was to see in her years at the Circle G, Willa never became comfortable with the sight of one of God's creatures suffering. Huddled in the back of the small pen was a dark-colored lump of fur. She quietly approached the calf, who didn't even respond when she touched its shivering flank. The calf was too weak to lift its head. "She's chilled," Willa murmured to Ryder, who had come up silently to stand beside her. "Not much muscle tone. I'm not sure we're going to have any luck with this one." He crouched down beside her and laid a gentle hand on the calf's side. "Tell me what to do," he said softly. "We've got some colostrum saved for situations like this. It's the milk that's produced for a few days after a cow gives birth. The calves need the extra nourishment that it provides. Stay here, and I'll go get it." When Willa returned, Ryder had pulled the 40-pound calf onto his lap and covered it with his new coat. She sent one of the hands for blankets and hot water bottles. "Well, don't you two look nice and cozy?" Ryder looked up at her, concern on his face. "She's not moving." "All right," Willa said briskly, all business again. "We call it bottle feeding, but you're probably going to have to use this at first." She handed him what looked like a turkey baster and supervised as he drew some of the yellowish liquid up and squeezed a few drops into the calf's mouth. Its tongue moved a little bit, but the calf's eyes were rolled back, and it was too weak to swallow. "A little further back," she instructed, "and massage her throat gently to help her get it down." Ryder did as she asked, and after a few more minutes of watching, she reluctantly decided that he'd do just fine. She might not make it, Willa warned him, not wanting to paint too dark of a picture of the situation, but also not wanting to give Ryder false hope. She looks like she's closer to dead than alive. I've had calves that look better than this, not survive. He met her eyes over the animal's dark head, and her heart gave a hard thump at the combination of love and determination she saw there. Go do what you have to do. We'll be fine, he said. Just fine. Several hours later, when Willa returned to find Ryder sprawled on his back in the straw, fast asleep, and the calf that had been sleeping next to him lifted its head and gave a quiet moo at her approach, she knew that yes, they would be just fine. After the first few painful mornings, in which Ryder woke up feeling as if he'd been stampeded by bulls the day before, Ryder and Willa's lives fell into a comfortable routine. They woke early, had breakfast together, and took to the fields to take care of the stock. Then, Ryder went off to take care of Beulah the calf and learn more about working with horses, and Willa headed the opposite direction to handle her duties for the day. They then met up around 6 most nights, got cleaned up, and then had a companionable dinner together before watching some television and going to bed. Willa still wasn't completely over her shyness when it came to sleeping in the same bed with Ryder. Somehow, she always ended up tangled up around him in the morning, but she was beginning to understand the appeal of being married. When she came home in the evenings, the house wasn't quiet. Or, if it was, it wouldn't be for long. Ryder kept her laughing with his stories about Beulah the calf, who had officially adopted him as her mama, or sharing a joke he'd heard that day from Brody. Mrs. Hollis always prepared their meals and left them in the oven on warm or in the refrigerator to heat up, but they shared dish duty afterwards. He washed, she dried. And when they went to bed at night, his body was a big, solid, and warm bulk at her back that she knew she'd miss if she ever had to sleep alone again. A month into their marriage, everything seemed to be finally running along smoothly. Except that Willa didn't think Ryder was attracted to her anymore. They'd talked and talked, sharing stories about their lives, their likes and dislikes, biggest fears. Ryder's was heights and Willa's was shots, but he didn't give any indication that they were nearing the end of the getting-to-know-you stage and ready to move on to the next mysterious benefits of marriage stage. They kissed goodbye every morning, but more and more, Willa was wondering if the crazy exhilaration she felt when their lips touched was one-sided. Was he viewing her as a friend and a roommate now, or heaven help her, one of the guys, instead of as his wife? She was worrying herself sick over the question, rather than entering the wholesale beef order numbers on her computer, when Mrs. Hollis poked her tightly curled head into the office. "You want some iced tea or anything before I head out?" she asked. "No. Yes please. Maybe you could bring one for yourself, too, and we could sit for a while." The woman gave her a strange look, but nodded briskly and headed back toward the kitchen for drinks. Was she really thinking about asking Mrs. Hollis for advice? The housekeeper had always been a part of Willa's life, but they'd never had a very close relationship. She honestly wasn't even sure if the woman liked her. And maybe the Mrs. in her name was just an honorary one. She didn't know if there even was or ever had been a Mr. Hollis. But, too soon, the housekeeper was back. She pulled out a chair across from Willa's grandfather's big desk and collapsed back into it with a satisfied sigh, crossing her booted feet at the ankles. Looking around the office curiously, from the big stuffed buck's head mounted on one wall to the thick burgundy carpet under their feet, she asked in her typical straightforward way, "Have you thought about changing things up in here? Making it a little more girly?" "When have you ever known me to be girly?" Willa asked in a dry tone, and the older woman chuckled. "I guess you got a point there," she replied. "So, what's on your mind? You've never asked me to have a sit-down with you in the middle of the day before. Or a sit-down at all, for that matter." Willa opened her mouth, but the word she wanted wouldn't come out. "Is there a Mr. Hollis?" she asked instead. Mrs. Hollis let out a loud bark of laughter, her bird-bright eyes almost disappearing in the wrinkles around them. "Well, of course there is, girl. You think I'm an imposter? Why have I never met him?" "If possible," Mrs. Hollis laughed even harder. "You have," she finally choked out. "A few times. Remember old Harvey?" Been here working for your grandfather nigh on 26 years? Willa pictured the grizzled, stocky old cowhand she'd known since she was a child and slapped her forehead. Duh, Harvey Hollis. How did I not know you two were married? Probably because she'd never heard Harvey speak more than 4 words at a time and had never seen the two of them together. And now, putting a face to Mr. Hollis, she really didn't want to continue her line of questioning. Mrs. Hollis wiped her eyes and took a big gulp of her iced tea. Oh, child, you really don't see much beyond your own nose, do you? The words seemed harsh, but her tone was almost kind. If it doesn't have to do directly with the goings-on here at the Circle G, it doesn't exist for you. I have a feeling that your young man is opening your eyes a bit, though. Am I right? Mrs. Hollis gave her a wink, and Willa thought she'd fall out of her chair. The housekeeper had never shown Willa this mischievous side. Well, it was now or never. She scrunched her eyes shut. Not as much as I'd like, she blurted. Mrs. Hollis, how do I get him to go to bed with me? When the woman didn't immediately answer, Willa tentatively peeked at her face. The housekeeper wore a dumbfounded expression. You two sleep together every night. You're married and have been for a whole month, for Pete's sake. You mean you haven't? She waved a hand in a vague circular motion. Not yet, Willa admitted miserably. We agreed to get to know each other better first, but now I'm not sure how to let him know I'm ready to take things beyond the friend zone and be a real wife. Mrs. Hollis leaned back and set her tea down on the side table. I never had kids, didn't think I'd ever be in the position to give the birds and the bees talk. I know how things work. I own a ranch. Well, a bull and a cow are a little more basic. Hopefully you'll be happily surprised to find out the difference. But as to the wooing, you just have to let him know that you're ready to take things to the next step. I can't just tell him, though, Willa protested. I'd die of embarrassment first. And what if he's changed his mind? Oh, I'm sure he hasn't. I've seen the way he looks at you, Mrs. Hollis chuckled. You'd have to be a lot older than I am to miss seeing the sparks that fly from that man's eyes when you come into view. But if you can't tell him straight out that you're ready for him, you need to show him. Men are very simple creatures. Flirt with him. He'll get the idea pretty quick. And another thing. You need to show Ryder that he's important to you and make him a priority. I know you're a busy girl, but if you want to make a successful marriage, you have to make sure you're making time for your man, too. Mrs. Hollis gave her a teasing smile and another wink, smoothing down her sweatshirt, this one with sparkly cardinals embroidered on the front. Speaking of which, I'm off to make my man a special dinner and do some flirting of my own. Maybe you should take Ryder into town and get a restaurant meal for a change. As the housekeeper gathered up the empty glasses and left the room with a definite spring in her step, Willa dropped her head into her folded arms. Mrs. Hollis had given her a lot to think about, but she and Harvey flirting? That was a mental picture she could do without. Ryder came into the house whistling. It had been a good day. Beulah had taken to the bottle with a minimum of spilled milk, and she was putting on pounds every day. He was a little worried about her umbilical stump. He didn't know anything about what it was supposed to look like, but having spent so much time with the calf, he'd noticed it was looking a little swollen and felt warm to the touch. He reminded himself to ask Willa what she thought. Willa. He couldn't wait to see her. It was the same every day. Coming home was half pleasure, half torture. He looked forward to every second he was able to spend with her, but he didn't know how much longer he could be patient in the marital relations department. He went to the sink and started soaping up his hands. Hey. Her husky voice made him jump. It was like he'd conjured Willa from his thoughts. But when he turned to look over his shoulder to greet her, his tongue stuck to the roof of her mouth. She wasn't wearing her usual flannel shirt and jeans. Instead, she had on a flowing, multicolored skirt that outlined her long legs with each little movement and a loose peasant-style embroidered top. But her hair was the most striking change. She'd left the dark mass of it long and loose, spilling over her shoulders, with only the sides pulled back into tiny braids that fastened at the back of her head. She smiled at him shyly. I was wondering if you wanted to go into town tonight? Mrs. Hollis needed a night off from cooking. Mutely, he nodded and cleared his throat. Sure. Let me just shower the barn smell off of me, and I'll be ready. After what seemed like the quickest shower he'd ever taken in his life, Ryder shaved, slapped on some cologne and put on khakis and a blue button-down shirt. In just the short time he'd been at the ranch, the clothes already felt unfamiliar, but tying his Converse sneakers was like welcoming an old friend. Willa wasn't sure that dinner had been such a good idea. The long ride into town was a little bit awkward, but after Ryder pulled out her chair for her and slid into his own across the candlelit table, he gave her his familiar teasing grin that immediately made her feel more at ease. Mrs. Pearce, are we out on a date? Why yes, Mr. Pearce, she replied, giving him a testing flutter of her eyelashes. I think we are. It might have technically been flirting, according to Google, but Willa was pretty sure it just looked like she had dust in her eyes. Then, if I may, I'd like to tell you how gorgeous you look. Where did you have those clothes hidden away? I've never seen them in our closet. She brushed at the white blouse self-consciously. They were my mother's. I don't have any dresses of my own. That's okay, Ryder assured her. They look as if they were made for you. But you look just as beautiful in your everyday clothes. She was saved from scrambling for a reply as the waiter came by just then to take their order. After he'd brought their drinks back, Ryder had insisted on a glass of champagne once he'd heard Willa had never tried it. Ryder thankfully moved their conversation back to more comfortable territory. They were laughing about the tooth marks he swore he sported on his shoulder from his efforts to win over Franklin, the angry black gelding, when their food arrived. Willa had steak. Ryder had fish. No red meat today, she asked, pointing a fork at his plate. He shook his head sheepishly. Maybe after I'm done bottle-feeding Beulah. As they walked back to her truck through the chilly, moonlit parking lot, Ryder casually held her hand. She couldn't help but notice that his palms were already rougher than they had been on the day of their wedding. She wondered for a heated moment what they'd feel like against her skin, and how soon she could find out. He stopped her at the truck. You know, I was so distracted earlier when I got home that I forgot something. He stepped forward, and she shivered at the contrast between the cold metal from the truck at her back and the warmth from his body. I forgot to kiss my wife. She wasn't sure if the feeling came from the champagne's tickly bubbles earlier, or just the heady nearness of Ryder. Was it the mouth-watering scent of his aftershave or the fact that he tasted like the chocolate mousse they'd had for dessert? Whatever the reason, Willa went lightheaded and weak in the knees all at the same time. Determined to do as Mrs. Hollis had suggested and show him she was ready, instead of passively allowing him to kiss her, she stepped into his embrace and lifted a hand to run her fingers through the silky, longish strands of his hair. He murmured his approval against her lips and angled his head to deepen the kiss, running one broad palm down her back. Feeling braver at his obvious enjoyment, she nipped at his bottom lip and smiled, feeling the stir of feminine power for the first time when he groaned and broke away, breathing heavily. 100% best after-date kiss ever, he growled. Who says our date has to be over? She was rewarded for her boldness by the gleam in his eyes and the wicked smile that appeared on his lips. The ride home went by in a blur of nerves and anticipation, and soon they were turning into the drive of the Circle G, dizzy at the thought that tonight would actually be the night. Willa almost didn't notice the livestock veterinarian's truck parked outside the main barn. But Brody, coming out of the barn with a long-legged purposeful stride, caught her attention. Something's wrong, she murmured. When Brody reached the two of them at the truck, it was Ryder that he looked to with sympathy. Hey, guys, sorry to interrupt. I wanted to let you know that I called the vet for the bottle feeder. She's not doing so hot. I can take care of it, though. I don't want to mess up any of your plans. He eyed Willa in her dress, obviously trying not to stare. Beulah? Ryder asked with a sick feeling in his stomach. Is it her umbilical stump? Willa and Brody looked at him in surprise. I should have said something, he said, slamming the heel of his hand hard against the tailgate. I had a feeling it was infected. How bad is she? It's not looking good, was all Brody would say. Before Ryder could go tearing off to the barn, Brody put a hand on his arm. Hey, man, you did good with her. All the guys are saying so, even though they gave you a hard time for being her mama. Sometimes, these little ones just don't make it. They don't get enough colostrum, pick up an infection. Even if she survives this, she's likely to pick up something else that might finish her off. Ryder nodded in acknowledgement but hurried toward the barn. Brody winced and gave Willa an apologetic look. Looks like I ruined a date night. But Willa didn't mind as she watched Ryder head into the barn, heedless of his dressy clothes or beloved black and white sneakers. She realized that if Ryder had ignored the little calf's plight and let Brody handle the situation, he wouldn't be the man she'd fallen in love with. The vet gave Beulah a barrage of shots, an anti-inflammatory, antibiotics, vitamin B, but the calf still looked sickly and listless. She'd been fine when he'd left her, Ryder thought, but now she looked like she was knocking at the bovine pearly gates. The vet left him with instructions for her care but warned him that the prognosis wasn't great. Ryder didn't care. He'd do what he could and leave the rest in God's hands. Willa stopped in shortly after the vet had departed. She'd changed out of her pretty clothes and back into serviceable denim and wool. To Ryder, she still looked good enough to eat. I brought you some coffee, she said quietly in the hushed, nighttime stillness of the barn. I don't suppose it would do any good to tell you to come into the house and let one of the hands sit with her tonight? Nah, he replied, trying for a joking tone. I don't want to leave her out here, and Beulah's gotten so big, I don't think she'd fit in our bed. Hey, if she makes it, you're not going to sell her, right? He couldn't stand the thought of her ending up on a plate at the gym. Willa smiled. No, Brody and I already talked that over. She's a twin and not likely to be fertile, but we won't sell her out from under you. Even if she can't have her own babies, she'll live out her days here as a pet cow. Circle G's first. Can't guarantee we'll let you near any other bottle feeders, though. Fair enough, Ryder laughed, settling deeper into his straw and pouring himself a cup of coffee out of the thermos she'd brought him. I'm not sure I'm cut out for motherhood anyway. You'll have to just let me baby the horses instead. Or, maybe our own baby someday. She jumped as if stung, but he didn't look up at her. He was stroking the calf's dry muzzle. Well, I guess I'll see you tomorrow, Willa said uncertainly. I had a great time tonight, Ryder replied, and the wicked sparkle came back into his eyes. We'll have to try it again soon. Willa tried not to be jealous of a cow, but it was hard. She went almost a week without seeing her husband, except when he took brief breaks from nursing to take a quick shower or wolf down a meal. He wasn't even sleeping in their bed at night, and as she'd feared, it was cold and lonely without him. Beulah had perked up the day after her injections, and her infection was clearing up, but then, as Brody had predicted, she came down with a tough respiratory infection. Ryder wasn't looking much better. He hadn't taken time to shave, and a straw mattress and scratchy horse blankets didn't appear to be giving him restful nights of sleep, judging by the shadows under his eyes. Still, Willa admired Ryder's dedication. There were a lot of animals at the Circle G, but that didn't mean they wanted to lose any. She'd have done the same thing in his place and... Chapter 6. Ryder felt like he'd been poleaxed. At the sight of her golden shoulders against the creamy sheets, her dark hair loose and long, he immediately forgot the idea of pizza as a hunger of a different kind gnawed at him. Willa, I'm in love with you. The words were out of his mouth before he could call them back, but her nervous expression softened immediately. You beat me to it, Ryder. I was going to tell you first. He dropped the towel, and she caught an intriguing glimpse of lean muscles and that masculine part of him she was so curious about before he pulled back the sheet and climbed into bed with her. She shivered as the cool air brushed over her skin, but Ryder didn't give her time to feel anything else but excitement. He whispered sweet, ticklish things into her ear and proved just how clever his broad hands were as they caressed every part of her, kissing her all the while until she was limp and breathless with need. As they were poised for completion, Ryder met her eyes. Say it for me, please? I love you, Ryder, she breathed as he slid home. His breath was warm on her neck as he whispered, I love you, too, Willa. And then they gave each other a glimpse of heaven. Willa woke slowly, gradually aware of aches in her body that she'd never experienced before as she stretched. But she woke up smiling, immediately remembering the incredible night she and Ryder had shared. He'd made her feel so loved, so precious, and the feeling was almost overwhelming in its intensity. Inside and out, Willa felt like she was absolutely glowing. And then she noticed that, once again, the sun was shining through the curtains across a bed that was empty except for her and the crumpled blankets. She'd overslept. For the second time during her marriage. She never overslept. Sitting up quickly, she checked the clock. It was already after 9. Before she could jump up, the bedroom door opened, and Ryder, his cheeks still scruffy with a night's growth of stubble, eased in with a tray in his hands. "Morning, sunshine," he grinned. "How are you feeling?" "Late," she grumbled. "I cannot believe I overslept again." "Oh, that was my fault." He set the tray he carried down next to her, and the smell of French toast drifted toward her. She hadn't had French toast in ages, and her mouth automatically watered. There were 2 plates on the tray stacked high, plus 2 glasses of orange juice and a dish of strawberries. "I figured you could use a little extra sleep this morning since I kept you up so late last night." She couldn't help it. She immediately bristled. "Ryder." He popped a strawberry in her mouth. "Don't worry, I already talked to Brody. Everything's under control." She chewed the tart, delicious berry and swallowed. "You can't just decide." This time he stopped her protest with a kiss. He'd obviously snuck a few strawberries himself, before bringing up the tray, because he tasted like summer sunshine and hot mail. Her knees went weak right along with the protest she had planned to make. "Come on, Willa," Ryder asked softly, brushing her hair back with one gentle hand to her cheek. "Just go with it, okay? Give us a day to just spend with each other." One pleading look from his deep blue eyes, and she couldn't think of any reason she should refuse him. "One day," she agreed finally, picking up a fork. What could one day hurt? Breakfast quickly turned playful when Ryder insisted that they feed each other. It became more serious as Ryder accidentally dripped syrup on Willa and insisted on cleaning it up with his tongue. The French toast was soon forgotten and things got even stickier after that, so, of course, the 2 of them had to shower. They ended up using another hour of their morning and all of the hot water. "You're going to kill me, wife," Ryder groaned, falling back on the bare mattress they'd stripped after their shower, clad only in a big green bath towel that gaped open, showing one well-muscled thigh. Willa sat on the bedroom chair across from him, not even embarrassed by her own nakedness, as she toweled her hair dry. "I can't believe I married such an insatiable woman." "I blame you," she teased. "You were the one that showed me what I'd been missing. Now you have to deal with the consequences." "As a matter of fact," she purred, putting down the brush, "I think you're going to have to deal with them right now, all over again." She dropped her towel on the floor and stalked toward him, a wicked gleam in her eye. "I guess if I have to," Ryder replied, splaying his arms across the bed, smiling widely. "Come and get me." Willa pounced. Ryder decided he'd been right. Life with Willa would never be boring. As he drove them toward home, his headlights cutting across the dark roads, he snuck a glance at her. She was sleeping in the passenger's seat, her face as innocent as a child's. They'd spent the day playing like children, once they'd managed to leave the house. He couldn't believe it, since she could see the darned thing from her backyard, but Willa hadn't been to Mount Rushmore since her grandmother had taken her. That had been almost 20 years before, when she was only 4, and of course, she didn't remember any of it. He'd insisted that they visit Mount Rushmore that day, pretending to be tourists from Idaho. Ryder would be Barry, and Willa would be his wife, Bernice. Looking at him as if he were crazy, Willa agreed but immediately jumped into the spirit of the silly game, posing for dozens of selfies, peppering the tour guides with questions, and basically blending in with the other tourists, finally standing in awe of the massive monument. Afterward, they browsed through the information center and bookstore, where Willa insisted on picking out a stack of books on area history for him. They had dinner at Carver's Cafe, pot roast for Willa and buffalo stew for Ryder, since he wasn't personally acquainted with any buffalo, and ice cream before buying each other goofy souvenirs in the gift shop and heading home. Willa's high spirits and enthusiasm for everything they'd done were such a contrast to her normal all-business, sober attitude that Ryder felt like he'd spent the afternoon with a completely different person. And now the day was over. He dreaded the alarm going off at 5 the next morning. He didn't want to go back to the serious Willa. He wanted to spend time getting to know her flirty, playful side, finding out what she was like without all of the baggage that came along with being a ranch owner. Ryder wasn't even sure Willa knew what kind of person she was. She'd been saddled under responsibilities for so long, she'd probably never had a chance to find out. But maybe, Ryder mused, glancing again at his sleeping wife, it was time to see if he could do something about it. Her alarm chirped obnoxiously at 5 a.m., and as she rolled over to shut it off, for the first time, Willa wanted to unplug the clock and pull the blankets back over her head. Yesterday had been so unreal, she honestly couldn't remember the last time she'd had so much fun, and she wanted to repeat the whole thing over again. But, Willa reminded herself with a sigh, work on the Circle G never ended, and that meant that the boss couldn't afford to slow down either. She started to get up, but an arm sneaked around her waist, and she found herself pulled back against a hard male chest. "Where are you going?" Ryder asked, his voice still gravelly with sleep. "Time to get up," she murmured, snuggling back against him. "New rule," Ryder replied, kissing her just below her ear. "We get up at 5, but we don't get out of bed until at least quarter after." "You're a bad influence, Mr. Pearce." "But make it 5:30, and I think I can get behind that rule," Willa agreed breathlessly as Ryder's clever fingers began to explore. Ryder waited impatiently all morning for Willa to be safely closeted away, updating records on the computer, before he cornered Brody coming out of one of the stalls in the barn. "Hey," Brody grinned. "You guys have a good time yesterday?" "We did." Ryder fell into step beside the other man. "As a matter of fact, that's kind of what I want to talk to you about." "Man, I don't want to hear any of the lovey-dovey details. I haven't had a date in 6 months." "I wouldn't share any details with you, anyway," Ryder laughed. "Unless you want the name of a good matchmaker, but I really do need to talk to you. You have an office or anything we could hang out in for a while?" "Sure." Brody stopped long enough to wash his hands and then led Ryder up the staircase built against the back wall of the barn to the loft, half of which held hay and the other half a modern apartment and office. "Come on in," he offered, gesturing toward a comfortably beat-up chair across from a desk piled high with paper. "Pop?" He opened the door to a sleek little mini-fridge and grabbed a Coca-Cola. "Soda, you mean?" "Yeah, thanks, City Slicker," Brody shot back easily and settled in behind his desk. "So, what's up?" he asked, raising an eyebrow curiously. Ryder took a deep breath. "Willa's working too hard. I want to help her scale back." Brody chuckled. "You serious? Does your wife know you're here?" "Yeah, I am," Ryder said calmly, sitting back in his chair. "And no, she doesn't." Brody stopped laughing and took a thoughtful sip of his drink. "You know she wouldn't be thrilled that you're having this conversation with me instead of her. Matter of fact, she wouldn't be thrilled with either of us. You trying to get me in trouble?" "No. But yesterday, I saw a whole different side of Willa." Ryder described their day at Rushmore and noted without jealousy the way Brody softened and smiled in disbelief. The man loved Willa like a sister. It was obvious he truly cared about her. "You're right. I haven't seen that side of her," Brody admitted ruefully. "Ever since I've known Willa, she's been focused on one thing." "Running the ranch?" "More than that. Proving herself. To me, her grandpa, the Hands. Anybody she could. I think she always knew that Griffin would have preferred to be raising a boy, so she set out to show him and everybody else that she could do anything a boy could. She succeeded, at least with us, but she never left time in her life for anything else except the ranch, and I don't think she would have the first idea of how to separate herself from things." "I don't want her to separate herself from what she loves," Ryder said quietly. "She wouldn't be Willa without this place. I just want her to have the time and space for new things in her life, if she wants them. A dog, maybe kids, heck, even a hobby. She could pick up underwater basket weaving or cordon bleu cooking for all I care, if it makes her happy. Brody was quiet for a moment, picking up a pen to fiddle with it. I agree with you, he finally replied, but my first loyalty is to Willa. I still don't think she'll appreciate the interference. What do you have in mind? Well, I may not be able to preg test a cow, Ryder said wryly, since my background is in public relations and not agricultural science, but I've got a college degree in business management and know my way around efficiency, general management, time-saving processes, things like that. He stood up and began to pace the small area, excitement building in his voice as he tried to sell the foreman on the idea. It's always been fascinating to me, how to take a great operation and make it function even better. I even thought about opening a consulting firm before I went the PR direction. Anyway, I want to see if I can blend what I know with what you know. But before I can streamline things, I'm first going to need you to teach me everything you know about this place, bottom up, so I could run it myself. Excuse me? Willa stood in the doorway, hurt and disbelief written across her face. The sunshine and late Indian summer they were having was going to finally be coming to an end, Willa realized as she checked the weather report. A cold front was forecasted to come in tonight, and, beginning the next day, the temperatures were going to finally catch up with the calendar. They were looking at lows in the 20s and the possibility of the season's first snowstorm later in the week. Winter in the Black Hills was about to arrive. Willa looked out the window of her office. The sky was a brilliant blue, with just a light breeze teasing the trees, and the sun was shining almost hard enough to convince her that the weatherman was wrong. She shut down the computer. Maybe she didn't have time to get away from the ranch with Ryder again today, but at the very least, they could go ride fences together. Maybe on horseback. Star was back to 100%, and Ryder had been really coming along on his lessons. She could show him the hills that she loved, in the best way there was to experience them. Willa grinned to herself. Who was she kidding? She didn't need to use the weather or the ranch as an excuse. She just wanted to hang out with him. Ryder and Brody, usually as thick as thieves, were nowhere to be found, but Billy pointed her toward Brody's office. They headed up there a little while ago, the young man said cheerfully. Haven't seen them come down yet. Thanks, she said, heading toward the stairs, and then taking them two at a time. Brody's office door was closed, but she pushed it open, not thinking to knock. Teach me everything you know about this place, bottom up, so I could run it myself. She stopped, sure that she hadn't heard Ryder right, but when she incredulously said, "Excuse me," and the two men faced her in surprise, guilty looks on their faces, she knew. Betrayal quickly iced over into anger. It was never about me, was it? Willa spat accusingly at Ryder. From the beginning, you never intended to leave things the way they were. All along, you were just trying to lull me, ever since you heard about the terms of the will. Emotion choked off Willa's voice. To her fury, she realized she was seconds away from crying. Before Brody or Ryder could reply, Willa spun around, hot tears blurring her eyes. She started to grab the railing on her way down to the main floor, but she was moving so fast, her foot missed a step, and then she was falling, and the things that happened next came and went in bits and pieces. Her elbow knocking hard against the wall, a sharp pain in her hip, a blinding one in her ankle, and finally, something hard cracking against the back of her head, and then there was nothing else. Ryder's only thought was to get to Willa and explain that what she thought she heard wasn't what was going on at all. The look on her face before she'd run from the room, he wanted to kick himself. Brody was right. He should have spoken directly to her first. But the pit of dread in his stomach was nothing compared to the absolute terror that gripped him when he exited Brody's office just in time to see her slip. He was already in motion, knowing he wouldn't be in time to catch her, but having to try, and saw every moment of her fall in a sequence that would haunt his nightmares. He felt like his feet didn't even touch the steps as he flew down them, coming to his knees beside Willa's still form. He hesitated, afraid to touch her. She was crumpled on the dusty floor like a rag doll, her face pale, and her eyes closed, the lids looking fragile and almost translucent. He didn't hear Brody yell at a white-faced Billy to call for an ambulance first and to get Mrs. Hollis second. He didn't hear himself uttering, "Dear God, dear God, dear God," unable to even get out a full prayer. "Ryder," Brody barked, jolting him out of it. She's got a pulse. She's breathing. She's going to be okay. Come on, you're not helping her. Brody was taking her vitals, Ryder realized. Then, his Red Cross training finally kicked in, those handy skills he renewed every couple of years but had never had the chance to use, and he took a deep breath. Willa needed him and it was time to focus. Chapter 7. There was a jackhammer pounding at the back of Willa's skull, and she moaned, rolling her head to the right, trying to get away from it. The small movement caused various levels of pain to trigger in different parts of her body all at once. Can't you do something for her? She's obviously hurting. Ryder. She tried to open her eyes to ask him for help, but they felt so heavy, and the aches were already starting to recede a little. Calm down, Mr. Pearce, came a woman's soothing voice. We just gave her another shot of morphine. And then Willa was drifting away again. It was late that evening when Willa finally opened her eyes. The first thing she saw was Ryder sleeping in an uncomfortable-looking pink chair next to her bed. His tall form was awkwardly angled so that his hand rested on the white sheets beside her, within reaching distance. Her heart immediately squeezed at the sight of him. His eyes were closed, shadowed underneath with dark circles, and a light scruff of beard covered his cheeks. His clothes were wrinkled, and his hair was standing on end in places where it looked like he'd run his hands through it. He was the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen. She reached out and touched his hand. His eyes flew open, staring wildly for a moment before he realized she was awake. He turned his hand over, palm up, and squeezed warmly. What happened? She asked, her voice sounding rusty. You're in the hospital, he replied. You fell down the stairs in the barn. The barn. Where she'd opened Brody's office door and heard the sound of her dreams crashing down around her. Carefully, she pulled her hand away. Ryder's eyes darkened with hurt, but he drew his own hand back and stood up. You have a mild concussion and lots of bruises. Plus, your ankle. It was broken pretty badly. They had to do surgery to piece it back together. You'll be off your feet for quite a while. Willa struggled to piece together his words and sat up quickly to see that her foot was, in fact, covered with a cast. Her head swam dizzily, and before she could protest, Ryder was putting an arm around her to ease her back to the pillow. The cast is a temporary one, to keep things immobile in there until you start to heal, he said. You've got some new hardware, a plate and some screws. The surgery went well, though, and the orthopedic doctor doesn't think there will be any lasting damage, as long as you take it easy during your recovery. How long? She asked, dreading his answer, but needing to hear it. Ryder answered reluctantly, his jaw tight. 10 weeks in a cast after they set you up with a more permanent one. 6 weeks in a boot after that, with physical therapy. Willa's hands clutched the sheets as her brain struggled to process. 4 months. She would be absolutely useless for 4 months. Trapped in the house. Bitterness surged. Well, she said, closing her eyes, unable to look at him. I guess you've got what you wanted. The ranch is yours. Ryder stared at Willa, her face pale against the white sheets of the hospital bed, a dark purple bruise already blooming on one cheekbone, and thought guilt would overwhelm him. If he'd just gone to her first, to talk about his ideas instead of talking to Brody. If she hadn't come in when she had. It was his fault that she was hurt so badly, and he deserved any abuse she wanted to dish out. I'll go see if I can find a doctor, now that you're awake, he said dully, missing the sight of Willa opening her eyes to watch him longingly as he walked away. 2 long days later, Willa was finally cleared to go home by the staff of the Lee Deadwood Regional Hospital. She couldn't seem to summon up any excitement about leaving, though, especially since she had to be rolled out by a nurse in a wheelchair, her bad ankle propped up in front of her, throbbing angrily at every jolt and bump. She wasn't looking forward to having to climb in the cab of a truck and was bracing herself for it when a sleek black car pulled up in the loading zone, and Ryder unfolded himself from the driver's side. What's this? She asked uncertainly. Our new car. Here, let me help you. She let him boost her out of the wheelchair and get her settled in the front seat, pushed back to its furthest position. Once he was back in the driver's seat, Willa wasted no time in questioning him. Why did you buy a car? He gave her a puzzled look before putting the car in gear and pulling smoothly away from the curb. I don't know how you expected to get around in a pickup truck. This thing, he jerked his head at the plush cream-colored leather interior, is easier to climb into. Plus, it's got all-wheel drive. And it's a wagon, with plenty of seating, in case we ever need to haul groceries for Mrs. Hollis. He'd been about to say something about kids, she knew. She let it slide, though, staring out the window at the passing highway, feeling tired at the thought of another conflict. Ryder had been at the hospital almost constantly since her accident, but they'd hardly spoken, and she didn't know how to break the silence or whether she wanted to. She still felt so cheated at the discovery he'd been conspiring with Brody, her best friend, to what? Take over the ranch? That was sure what it had sounded like. A thought occurred to her, and she shot him a suspicious look. How did you pay for this car? It's a BMW, and I might drive a Ford, but I know these German luxury cars aren't cheap. Ryder looked briefly away from the road, his knuckles whitening on the steering wheel. Do you think I took money from the ranch? He looked away from her again, hard lines bracketing his mouth. I brought my own money into this marriage, Willa. A lot of it. You may not trust me when it comes to the Circle G, but I'd never make a financial decision like that otherwise without asking you. She felt petty for a moment for even broaching the question, but then she pictured his guilty face in Brody's office, and Willa told herself she had the right to be suspicious of her husband. She turned back to the window, hardly seeing the fat snowflakes that had begun to blur past and trying not to notice how smooth the ride was compared to the bounce and jostle of her big truck. It was a quiet ride home. Ryder wished he could handle his wife as easily as he handled their new BMW through the wet snow that had begun to fall. She was so silent and unapproachable when she wasn't being prickly, he just wasn't sure how to reach past her barriers. He already missed the closeness they'd captured just a few days ago, both physical and emotional, and he wanted to apologize and explain to her about the conversation she'd overheard, but he didn't even want to remember that day. Every time he did, he saw her falling all over again, in slow motion, and it cut him again, right to his core. Hopefully the surprise he had waiting at home would thaw her a little. He pulled the car up to the front of the house and asked her to wait for him. Running to open the door first, he returned, scooped her out of the front seat as easily as he would a child, and nudged the door closed with his hip. She automatically looped her arms around his neck for balance, and he let himself inhale her scent for a moment. She'd had a shower just that morning with the help of one of the nurses, and she smelled like strawberry shampoo. I never did carry you over the threshold, Ryder said, and then did just that, not waiting for a reply. The excited clicking of toenails on tile greeted them as he booted the door closed behind him. Hold on, honey, let me get her settled in, first. What? Who is honey? Willa angled her head, trying to see around him, but Ryder just carried her into the living room and deposited her carefully on the couch. Willa, I'd like you to meet honey. The sweetest-looking golden retriever Willa had ever laid eyes on pranced after them into the living room, wagging her feathery tail eagerly. She went straight for Willa, snuffling her hands and then her face, swiping at her with friendly licks. Willa tried to hold back a giggle and failed, burying her hands in the dog's soft fur. Honey, that's enough, sit. Obediently, the dog plopped her rear down but continued to gaze at Willa adoringly. What did you do, Ryder? You're going to be spending a lot of time in the house, and I know you hate that, so I got you a friend to keep you company. He shrugged. It was my idea, but Mrs. Hollis actually found her for me. She knew of a family that was selling their farm and moving to New York. They didn't feel right keeping honey, since they're moving into an apartment, and she's used to wide open spaces. She's 4 years old, so she's past the chewing and housebreaking stage, and she's well trained, plus she was raised around livestock. To her horror, Willa felt her eyes tear up. She'd always wanted a dog, but her grandfather said they didn't have time to train one. Honey, seeing her distress, whined and put a paw on the couch beside her. She struggled back the tears and laid a hand on the dog's head, clearing her throat. She snuck a glance at Ryder's handsome, hopeful face. If he thought a dog was going to fix their marriage, he was mistaken. Thank you. She's very pretty, she said lamely. Ryder gave her one of his heart-melting grins and headed off to the kitchen to fix her a plate of pork chops that Mrs. Hollis had prepared earlier. She wanted to stay angry with him, but he was making it so difficult. The next morning, when the alarm went off at 5 and she automatically rolled over, only to feel a grinding pain in her heavy, cast-clad foot, Willa didn't find it hard to be angry at all. "Hold on," Ryder said, immediately jumping to his feet. "Let me help you." "I don't want any help," Willa ground out, shifting to bring her feet to the floor. The distance to the bathroom seemed like miles. She buried her fingers in her morning messy hair in frustration. Ryder's patience was unfailing, though. Not only did he help her to the bathroom, much to her embarrassment, but he came back a few minutes later with clothes and a low stool for her, helping her get dressed while she sat and fumed at the unfairness that had caused her to miss that step in the barn and end up in such a humiliating predicament. Ryder studied his lovely wife's face as she brushed and braided her hair with quick, impatient movements. He knew she was grumpy and embarrassed and in pain. Her expression would put a thundercloud to shame, but she was still so beautiful, it made his heart hurt to look at her. "Hey," he said softly. "I love you." Willa looked up at him, her dark eyes startled, but didn't seem able to reply. "Don't you think you should get going?" she said instead, her words clipped. "You've got a lot of work to do today." Ryder's jaw tightened. He wanted to snap at her and yell that this wasn't what he wanted at all. He wanted to hold her and tell her everything would be all right. He wanted to push her stubborn behind off the chair. Instead, he just smiled, it took some effort through gritted teeth, and went back into their bedroom for her crutches. Ryder settled Willa on the couch, an enthusiastic and sympathetic Honey by her side, and made breakfast quickly. She barely looked up from the dog when he set a cup of coffee and an insulated carafe on the table in front of her and an English muffin on a plate beside it. He set the remote control, a walkie-talkie, pain pills, a bottle of water, and her cell phone on the side table and arranged her crutches within easy reach. "You need anything else before I go?" "No," she replied, still not looking up. "Thanks." There went the idea of a good morning kiss, he thought. "All right. I'll be back around lunchtime." Willa didn't reply. She knew she was being annoying and ungrateful, but she didn't care. None of this was her fault. She should be the one heading out the door. This was her place, her job, her life, not his. Her eyes filled with tears. She wouldn't even be able to hobble out to the barn to see Star, much less ride him. Ryder called out "I love you" before the back door closed, but Willa stayed stubbornly silent and turned the channel to a raucous morning talk show, cranking the volume up to 10. Ryder stomped into the big barn, angry and irritated, because he was angry. It wasn't an emotion he normally dealt with. Life was too short to stay mad, and that had always been his unofficial motto. It didn't help when he got to the stairs that led up to Brody's office, and the vision of his wife's fall ran through his head again in full color. As he ran his hand up the smooth banister, he wondered if that was the place on the rough wooden wall where Willa had hit her head and gotten a concussion. Was that scarred step right there the one that was responsible for breaking her ankle? Would she have fallen if she hadn't been in such a hurry to get away from what she saw as her scheming husband? Brody's voice at the top of the stairs interrupted his dark thoughts. "Stop it," the other man advised. "She's home now, safe, and she'll be as good as new in a few months." "You're right," Ryder said, reaching the top of the steps, trying to shake the heavy feeling weight of his guilt. "Until then, I've got a lot to learn, and you've got a lot to teach me. Then I suggest we head to my office and have some coffee before we get started." Brody gave him a sympathetic look. "I'm guessing your patient hasn't made your morning an easy one. And, unfortunately, it's not likely to get better. We've got a fence break in the north pasture, and 3 of the boys are still trying to round up 12 missing cattle. Plus, we lost 2 contracts last week. One of our competitors was able to give them a better price, and nothing I've been able to do has made them budge on their decision. 2 more clients are making noises about canceling their contracts, too." "Oh, is that all?" Ryder asked in resignation, settling back with his coffee in the chair across from Brody's desk. Brody picked up his own cup, his lips twisting wryly. "I wish. We've also had an outbreak of coccidia in this last crop of calves. Happens sometimes when we get a wet fall. They're healthy, for the most part, and should be able to withstand it, but it's a pain to treat. Ryder closed his eyes, racking his brain for what he'd read about the parasite in his stash of ranching and cattle how-to books. We've already got them separated by ages, so the outbreak shouldn't spread. Feed and supplements are top-notch, so no changes needed there. Are you using Amprol or Corid in order to treat them? I know a regular dewormer won't work. Brody flashed him a look of surprise and a little admiration. We use Corid, and yeah, one of the guys is picking some up in town as soon as the vet clinic opens. How the heck did you know all that? What? I read. Ryder grinned. All right. Let's go find the rest of the cattle, and I'll tell you what I have in mind to make us more competitive in the market. By 11:45, Willa was trying not to watch the clock. She was bored. Daytime TV was driving her crazy. She'd already somehow been sucked into watching 3 episodes of a divorce court show, which only reminded her what an amazing husband she'd been blessed with. And that only made her more irritated, mostly with herself, because she was currently mad at her perfect husband and not ready to let it go. When she heard the door open in the kitchen, she had to steel herself against grabbing her crutches and hobbling out to the kitchen to greet Ryder. Instead, Honey scrabbled to her feet and ran to the kitchen, barking joyfully. Instead of Ryder, though, she heard Mrs. Hollis's voice, affectionate and gruff at the same time. Get off me, you dumb mutt, she growled, but Honey followed her happily into the living room, tongue lolling and tail wagging madly. How are you doing? She asked, crossing her arms and giving Willa a critical look. You're pale, she decided, not giving Willa a chance to reply. I've got some beef stew already made up. I'll get you a bowl so you've got some food in your stomach, and then you're taking a pain pill. No argument. Willa wanted to yell after her that she wasn't hungry and Mrs. Hollis couldn't make her eat, but that would have been immature. She stuck her tongue out in the direction of the kitchen instead. I saw that, young lady, came her gravelly voice. Keep it up, and you won't get any hot chocolate. True to her word, in less than 10 minutes, Mrs. Hollis had a mug of steaming hot chocolate with whipped cream, a bottle of water, and a bowl of fragrant stew with chunks of meat, carrots, and potatoes swimming in a thick gravy, and 2 thickly buttered slices of homemade bread on a tray. Ryder asked me to tell you he wouldn't be back for lunch, Mrs. Hollis said, gathering up the breakfast dishes and dirty mugs. Couple of the guys came down sick, and he's running into town. Looked pretty cold when I saw him, hopefully he took the truck with the good heater. She glanced at Willa, obviously trying to gauge the trouble between her and Ryder. He was out in the north pasture all morning chasing cows. Willa didn't say anything, just took a sip of her hot chocolate and pretended to watch the local news at noon. Mrs. Hollis shrugged and prepared to head back to the kitchen, her hands full. Oh, I think he was limping, too, she paused and added. Oh, no. What happened? Willa asked before she could stop herself, her heart racing. He could have fallen off a horse, slipped on some ice, been stepped on, cut himself. She knew just how dangerous work could be on a ranch, and Ryder, the city slicker who thought he could handle everything, didn't. Nothing, Mrs. Hollis chuckled, her face creasing in a grin. He wasn't limping. I was just checking to see if you cared. She laughed louder as Willa threw a piece of bread crust at her. Chapter 8. After Mrs. Hollis let Honey out and supervised Willa while she took her pain pills before she left, Willa slept for most of the day, Honey curled up beside her on the deep couch. It was dark when she woke, her lips tingling from a gentle kiss. Hey, Sleeping Beauty, Ryder said, leaning over to switch on the lamp on the side table. How was your day? She struggled up to a sitting position, and he obligingly stuffed a throw pillow behind her back. Fine, she said, not wanting to think about the boredom and all of the work she'd missed out on getting done. How was yours? Now that she looked at him, Ryder was smiling but looked exhausted. Probably no worse than any of yours ever are. I had to make a run into town, and I brought you some presents. Want to start with pizza? It's almost 10, but I don't figure you've had any dinner. Almost 10, she sat up again. How did I even sleep that long? You must have needed it. You want to go eat in the kitchen for a change of scenery, or are you more comfortable here? We can eat here. She eyed him with a little concern. Ryder stood up slowly, wincing. It must have been a hard day, she thought, harder than he had let on. He brought out 2 cans of pop and pizza on a couple of paper plates. Honey sat on her own corner of a couch, content to watch her humans. It had been a rough day, but Ryder didn't think it would be a good idea to burden Willa with any of it. Instead of telling her how he'd found a calf dead, likely attacked by coyotes, or how he was able to convince only one of their customers to come back, or how he'd never realized just exactly how disgusting cow parasites could be, he told her about how Beulah, jealous at the lack of attention in the past few days, had knocked him flat on his back in her hurry to see him. You have to be careful, she warned. Beulah thinks you're her mom now, and she's going to be getting big soon. I kind of figured that out today, he admitted ruefully. After they'd demolished the cold pepperoni pizza, he began hauling box after box from the kitchen to the living room, where he pushed the coffee table out of the way and stacked them up in front of Willa. What is all this? She asked curiously. Christmas is still a month out. You'll have to open them up and find out, he replied, nudging Honey away from where she sniffed curiously at the top one. I started ordering on Amazon when we were in the hospital and I found out you were going to be off your feet for a while. Don't feel bad if you don't like something, I can always send it back. Gifts had always been rare and practical from her grandfather. Feeling unaccountably excited, because she knew Ryder well enough to know that he wouldn't always give practical gifts, Willa grabbed the smallest package and used the penknife Ryder handed her to slice the tape. Inside was an assortment of boxed chocolates. He shrugged. I've never met anyone who didn't like chocolate. There's something wrong with people who don't like chocolate, she agreed. And if I ration these out, they might last me until spring. Don't bother, he laughed. I can always reorder them, and you could use to gain a few pounds anyway. The next box was bigger and held an assortment of stretchy, comfortable-looking outfits. Loose lounging pants that were cute and would fit easily over her cast and coordinating tops in different, muted colors. You're not the pink spandex type. He shrugged. Don't forget to check at the bottom of that one. Sure enough, there were several pairs of fuzzy socks. They've got some sort of non-slip stuff at the bottom, Ryder explained. You can cut a few of them, too, and slide them over your cast, to keep the toes on that foot warm. Willa stared in puzzlement at the contents of the third box. It was full of art supplies. I'm not an artist, Ryder. He gestured toward one of her great-grandmother's paintings on the wall, one of her favorites of a stallion running across a field. The colors and brushstrokes were so vivid and well executed, it looked as if the horse was about to leap off the edge of the painting. Have you ever tried? It might run in the family. I figure you have time to find out now. She nodded slowly, running her fingers over a fancy, embossed sketchpad, and then a package of watercolor paints. There were even charcoal pencils, pastels, markers, and colored pencils. At the bottom of the box, there were 2 intricately drawn coloring books, designed for adults. Just in case you don't have any natural talent, he said. I might need those. She smiled a little. Box after box turned up more thoughtful gifts. A beginner's beading set. Yarn, hooks, and instruction books for knitting and crochet. One heavy box was devoted to a spread of books, from popular fiction novels to romance to a Christian cowboy themed devotional to a paperback Russian spy series. A dozen different magazines on beauty trends, sports, current events, cooking, history, ranching, and puzzles. They were all subscriptions, he admitted sheepishly, so she should let him know which ones she didn't like, and he could cancel them, plus a lap desk, a warm hooded robe, card games, a needlepoint kit, and a calligraphy set for beginners. By the time she was done opening boxes, Willa was surrounded by a mountain of packing materials and enough distractions to keep her from going crazy for at least a few weeks. One more thing, Ryder said and headed back out to the kitchen. He returned a moment later with what looked like a child's toy tucked under his arm. It's a scooter. I picked it up from the doctor's office when I was in town. He set it on the floor. It was black and had a padded seat, handlebars, and a basket on the front. You put your knee on it, like this, he demonstrated, and it keeps the weight off your ankle, then you push with your other leg. He did and sent the little scooter zooming around the living room, with Honey barking and running behind him like he'd lost his mind. He hit the handbrakes and stopped next to the couch again, smiling sheepishly. I figured it would be kind of fun and more comfortable than crutches. I'm going to see if I can get one of the guys who's more mechanical than I am to rig it up with off-road wheels. Why did you do all this? Ryder gave her a sideways look. What do you mean why? This. Willa gestured to the stack of gifts. She couldn't help it, she was suspicious of her husband's motives. Did you do all of this out of guilt? Ryan's smile faded. No, Willa. It's not out of guilt. I got you these things because I can afford to do it, and I'm worried about you going crazy here all day, all cooped up. Her stomach started aching at his hurt tone, but she couldn't make herself apologize. The guilty look on his face when she caught him discussing the ranch with Brody kept playing through her head like a bad scene from a movie. She stayed silent. Ryder sighed in resignation. I'm going to let the dog out and hit the hay. He stood up and just looked at Willa for a long moment. Do you need help getting to bed? No, she answered stiffly. I'll be fine. I think I'm just going to sleep here on the couch. Well, good night, then. Ryder hesitated and looked at Willa for a long moment. I guess. Just yell for me if you need anything. I love you. Ryder called quietly for Honey as he walked away, his posture tired. Willa wanted to ask him to come back, to apologize, to have him smile at her and kiss her again, but she just couldn't make herself do it. I love you, too, she whispered to the empty room. Ryder stared up at the few stars visible among the clouds that were moving in, a light, cold wind brushing his face, while he waited for Honey to finish sniffing around by the bushes at the side of the house. He was at a loss. He'd always been sure of himself, who he was, where he was going, how to deal with the obstacles life threw at him. But now, it seemed as if Willa blamed him for her accident, and he couldn't figure out how to get their relationship back to where it had been before. He knew it was only the first day of taking on the responsibilities of the ranch, but that, too, seemed beyond his control. He had Brody to help him, but he didn't know how he could manage if each day was as frustrating and difficult as this one had been. God, help me out here, will you? He said out loud. Around him, fat flakes of snow began to fall, and above, the last few stars disappeared behind clouds. Despite the fact that nothing had changed, inside, the tension he felt started to ease, just a little bit. Everything would be all right, God had everything in hand, and things always turned out for the best. Eventually. The next few weeks fell into a routine for Willa as she and Ryder came to an awkward truce, silently agreeing to not talk about anything as uncomfortable as their relationship, the accident, or the ranch. Willa continued to sleep on the couch at night, accepting only the most necessary help from Ryder, and Ryder continued to deal with a flurry of problems on the ranch without letting on to Willa how stressed out he was or how much he missed their closeness. They lived together more like roommates than husband and wife, not hostile, but avoiding the issues that stood between them. Willa learned to get around well on the scooter Ryder bought for her and began to gain a little bit of her self-sufficiency back. She had an appointment in town with a physical therapist twice a week who gave her exercises that she performed every day, without fail. The therapist had warned her that to gain back her full mobility, she needed to work for it, and the thought of never being able to do the things she needed to do again was enough to scare her into a consistent effort to speed up her recovery as much as possible. Honey was a welcome distraction, and the sweet dog went everywhere with Willa. Which wasn't far, since Willa was still mostly homebound, but she was grateful for the company, and if she talked to the dog sometimes, well, that was nobody's business but theirs. Honey watched with interest as Willa began to explore some of the gifts that Ryder had bought her. She enjoyed several of the books and was playing around with learning to cook. The crafting projects were hit or miss. Some projects were failures, like crochet, for example, an exercise in frustration that always somehow ended with a lot of cursing and her fingers tied up in knots in the yarn. She donated the yarn and hooks to Mrs. Hollis. Beating, though, came naturally, and Willa found a satisfaction she hadn't expected in creating intricate designs. Painting, too, was becoming a little bit of an obsession. Through classes she found online, learning the basics of sketching, line, shape, form, and texture came easily, and though she wouldn't show anyone else her work, she was excited at how well many of her pieces turned out. Her happiness was shadowed, though, by the cloud that hung over her relationship with Ryder. She didn't know how to bring things back to where they had been, and she missed him. Ryder was getting used to the routine of his daily work, and though he was exhausted every night, he had to admit that there was satisfaction in the job. He and Brody still privately worried about the Circle G's beef contracts. The competitor, a nearby ranch called Silver Sage, who had snapped up some of their customers, was taking a big bite out of their bottom line and luring some of their best employees over, too, but they agreed not to burden Willa with any of it. She had her hands full with recuperation, and neither man wanted to see her stress out any more than she already was. Ryder was torn between resentment and relief at how much time ranch operations kept him away from Willa. He wanted to fix things between them but still didn't know how, and the sheer amount of work he had to do took all of his time. He thought back ruefully to the early days of their marriage and how annoyed he'd been when Willa hadn't made it home for lunch like she'd promised. If only he'd known what she was dealing with, he would have understood. He'd only managed lunch at home twice since Willa's accident. Tonight, though, he planned on being home in time for dinner. Willa had made an offer to cook, something so completely out of character for her, he didn't intend to miss it. Ryder also hoped that maybe they'd get the chance to talk. He'd been putting it off for too long. By 4 o'clock, Willa was regretting her offer and wished she'd just asked Ryder if he wanted to go into town. She was attempting chicken cordon bleu, a recipe rated as intermediate in her new cookbook. She'd learned how to do basics like soup and fancied up sandwiches. It's not like she was trying one of the expert-rated recipes. Intermediate, my foot, she muttered, trying to peg a toothpick into a slippery roll of chicken, ham and cheese. Cordon bleu chicken apparently needed a cordon bleu chef. The thing refused to stay together. She was re-rolling the mess after it had come apart in the baking sheet, yet again, when her elbow knocked into the package of sliced ham, sending it to the floor. Instantly, helpful Honey jumped to the rescue, and the rest of the ham was gone before she had a chance to rescue it. Now what? Willa demanded of the dog, who grinned back at her adoringly, hoping for more handouts. I can't make cordon bleu without ham. Are you talking to that dog again? Help had come, with a burst of cold air and a scattering of fat snowflakes. Mrs. Hollis, Willa breathed in relief. How did you know I needed you? The woman chuckled, breezing into the kitchen. Brody mentioned as how you were going to be cooking for Ryder tonight, and I just figured I'd swing by to see if you needed a hand. The woman eyed the pile of chicken on the counter in front of Willa. We need some sort of bat signal you can put out if you need help. What's that supposed to be? Chicken cordon bleu, Willa sighed. But it's not working out so well. Honey ate the ham. Mrs. Hollis rolled up her sleeves. No problem. Your man's going to be here in an hour, though, so we'd best see if we can turn this cordon bleu to Parmigiana in a hurry. It was later than Ryder had hoped when the wind blew him in at 5:45. A tantalizing smell was in the air, and he sniffed, identifying red sauce and something else. Sorry I'm late, he yelled. Let me wash up really quick. The house was quiet, Honey snoozing on the Navajo-patterned rug in the entryway, and he wondered for a moment where Willa was but hurried down the hall to their bedroom to grab a quick shower. Their door was closed, and he didn't think to knock, just opened it, only to stop short. Willa was in there in a pair of loose black pants, one knee up on the scooter, her back to him, naked from the waist up. Her silky fall of black hair only partially hid the smooth skin of her back and a tantalizing lacy peak of her black bra. He was immediately assailed by the memory of how her warm skin felt beneath his hands, and his breath caught in his throat. She threw a startled glance over her shoulder, dark eyes as wide as a deer's. Sorry, they both blurted at the same time, as she automatically crossed her arms over the creamy swell of her breasts. I didn't hear you come in, she muttered. I spilled sauce on my shirt. I was just going to take a quick shower. I'll go down the hall. Ryder left the room fast, afraid that he wouldn't be able to keep his hands off his wife if he didn't. That settled it, he thought to himself. They needed to work things out. He wanted Willa back in their bed. Chapter 9. Willa's cheeks felt hot when Ryder left, but it wasn't from embarrassment. She was in their bedroom. The bedroom they'd shared until her self-imposed exile to the couch, anyway. She'd just been thinking about Ryder, thinking about how much she missed that part of their marriage, and then, to have him walk in right at that moment. Something had to give. She pulled on a clean shirt and took a deep breath, wheeling her scooter out of the room. Thanks to Mrs. Hollis, a dinner disaster had been averted. She'd kept the chicken on low in the oven, not knowing exactly when Ryder would get home, and only had to make the pasta and heat up the garlic bread. They'd both figured Willa could handle that much without a problem. She filled up a pot with water, and then balanced it on the basket of her scooter and transferred it over to the stove, grinning a little. She may not be fully operational yet, but she was figuring out how to make things work. After putting the frozen garlic bread on a cookie sheet and popping it into the oven, she wheeled back to the sink to wash her hands. It was dark already, as she looked out the window over the kitchen sink, and in the floodlights from the barn, she could see fat snowflakes dancing in the strong wind. It was kind of nice, she admitted to herself, not to have to go out in that. Willa hated the cold. She was still watching the whirling snowflakes when she caught sight of Ryder's reflection in the glass behind her. "Hey," she said quietly. He came up behind her and slid his arms around her waist, smelling clean and fresh, his hair still damp from his shower. "Hey," he murmured, nuzzling her neck. "I've missed you." Willa knew he wasn't just talking about being gone for the day. She closed her eyes and leaned back into Ryder, soaking up his warmth. He kissed her in a sensitive spot just behind her ear, and her breath caught in her throat. "I've missed you, too," she admitted. "Are you hungry?" Ryder asked, his voice husky, the words sending a lick of heat through her. Willa broke away, only to turn the heat off under the boiling water. "Dinner can wait," she replied, turning around to face him. Talking could wait, too, she thought as he scooped her easily up in his arms. For the next hour, neither of them had to speak a word. The next morning, after a long, beautiful night spent with his wife, interrupted by only the beep of the smoke detector, set off by some very overcooked garlic bread, and an intimate dinner of slightly dry chicken parmigiana, Ryder's day was looking sunny, even though the wind chill was in the teens and the weatherman was promising 6 inches of new snow by nightfall. He poured a cup of coffee for Willa and sat down across from her with his own. "What's on your agenda today?" he asked. She wrinkled her nose and looked so cute, Ryder wanted to lean across the table and kiss her. "I've got some physical therapy exercises, but after that, not much. How about you?" Ryder thought quickly of the endless things he had to do, including interviewing replacements for the 2 most recent employees who had defected to their competitor's ranch. His sunshiny feeling dimmed a little, but he tried to smile like nothing was wrong. "The usual," he said offhandedly. "Fence checks this morning, a meeting with Brody around 1, and some paperwork after that." He technically wasn't lying, but he still felt uncomfortable with the omissions. Willa had enough to do, focusing on healing. She didn't need to deal with ranch problems. Willa didn't miss the way Ryder's eyes shadowed at her question. Was he working too hard? She had to remind herself that, whether he asked for these responsibilities or not, he wasn't used to the rigors of running a ranch. "Can I help with anything?" "Oh, no," he said, his smile a little bit strained around the edges. "You just focus on yourself for now. Have you read anything good lately?" She let the issue go, teasingly giving him the highlights of a futuristic police procedure novel she'd finished a couple days before, but decided privately that she'd surprise him and get on the computer later this afternoon. There wasn't any reason she couldn't help with paperwork. And, she thought with a little spark of excitement, there wasn't any reason they both couldn't work. Maybe the Circle G could benefit from a partnership after all. She might not have been willing to loosen up on the reins before, but after a few weeks' break, Willa could admit that it would be nice to share the load with someone. She jumped up from the table as quickly as her injured ankle would allow, filled with a rising sense of optimism, and hopped around to where Ryder sat. He looked up at her, alarmed, but she leaned down and gave him a kiss. "What was that for?" he asked in puzzlement. "Not that I'm complaining," he added, pulling her back in for another swift kiss when she laughed and tried to break away. "Nothing, cowboy, hadn't you better get to it? Cattle wait for no man." Ryder gulped down the rest of his coffee and pulled a heavy sheepskin jacket he'd bought online the week before. Tugging down his black stocking cap to cover his ears, he gave her his trademark heart-melting smile. "Miss me?" "Definitely," she assured him. And then he was gone, swallowed up in the cold, pre-dawn darkness. Before she did anything else, Willa made her way to the living room and pulled out her laptop. Christmas was coming, and she was going to order Ryder a real, 100% genuine cowboy hat. He had earned it. Brody was waiting for Ryder impatiently that afternoon. "We need to talk to Willa," he said, without preamble. "What's going on now?" Ryder pulled off his leather gloves and flexed his cold fingers. If this was what South Dakota was like in December, he didn't even want to know what kind of temperatures January would bring. He sank down in the chair across from Brody's desk and stretched out his legs. "I know you want to protect her and let her focus on that ankle of hers, but things are getting serious." Jake called from Merrill's Meats, and the Silver Sage offered them a better price than we could. "Merrill's is our biggest client." Ryder sighed, shutting his eyes and rubbing his temples, where the beginnings of a headache brewed. "Who is behind the Silver Sage? Why haven't they been an issue for us before?" Brody scowled. "I don't know anything about them, and I've lived in this area for the last 25 years. From what I can tell, it's a new outfit, and they're becoming more than just a burr in the Circle G saddle. We've lost 6 experienced hands to them, and now 8 beef contracts. They're threatening the livelihood of this ranch. You have to talk to Willa. I don't think she's going to appreciate being left in the dark on this. In fact, she's going to be furious when she finds out what's been going on." "You're right," Ryder said, feeling defeat creep up on him. "I'll go do it now." The money wasn't the issue, he thought, giving Star an absent rub as he passed the wickering horse. He'd made enough on the sale of his business that they could sell off all the cattle and do just fine running a petting zoo or something. A harsh wind smacked him in the face when he opened the door to the barn, making his eyes water. It was the fact that he'd failed Willa. It could only be his fault that things had gotten so bad so quickly. The ranch meant everything to her, and in a matter of weeks, he was running it into the ground. Willa stared at the computer, not comprehending the numbers she was seeing. Numbly, she scrolled through spreadsheet after spreadsheet. This couldn't be accurate. She had only been away from everything for a few weeks. There must be some mistake. "Hey, sweetheart." Honey gave a welcoming woof and pranced to the door, tail wagging. Willa slowly raised her eyes to see her husband framed in the doorway. A light dusting of snow in his hair was slowly melting. His cheeks were reddened by the wind, and his blue eyes looked tired. "Can we talk?" After one glance at his face, Willa knew all she needed to. Ryder looked guilty again. "What's going on here? Why does it look like half of my business is gone?" She almost choked on the last word. "We've run into some trouble lately. I didn't want to worry you with it." "The trouble," she bit out, her voice like ice, "is that you don't know the first thing about running a ranch. Why some incompetent city slicker dude from out east thought he could just waltz in here and take things over." Ryder's face hardened. "Stop, Willa. This city slicker is your husband, not some stranger off the street." She didn't care. Temper had taken over, and she pushed herself up from the desk shakily. "You made no secret of the fact that you wanted the ranch from the beginning. It's never even been about the marriage for you. As soon as you found out about the Circle G, I could see it in your face. You wanted it." "Stop it, Willa," Ryder said again, more harshly, his own temper finally fraying. "I had no idea about the Circle G, and you know it. I'm not the one who can't see past it to what's most important. Our marriage. I have enough money to support us through tough times." "Oh, and that makes it all better," she laughed bitterly. "You have enough money, so if my family's ranch fails, oh well. I thought everything would be fine if I just found a man who didn't know the first thing about ranching. A man who would leave everything to me, and who would stand back and let me do what I needed to do. Instead, you come into my life and get involved and wreck everything. It all came clear that day in Brody's office. Those words are burned into my head. Teach me everything you know about this place, so I can run it myself. I should have just married someone local, instead of going to some matchmaker. This was all a mistake. Even as she blurted the words, Willa knew she had gone too far. Ryder's face went pale and still. Willa's own heart twisted, and she wished she could call the words back, but it was too late. Even Honey whimpered and slipped past Ryder to leave the room, her tail tucked low. I'm sorry, he said quietly, the words seeming to echo in the office. I will accept that your injury is my fault. If you hadn't come in and only heard part of that conversation, you might not have run off and hurt yourself the way you did. I've done my best with the management of the Circle G and will accept any consequences of the decisions I've made. Make no mistake, though. He stalked toward the desk until they were nearly eye to eye and she could smell the light spice of his aftershave, underlaid with the clean smell of snow and the outdoors. Blame the matchmaker if you want, but I believe that God put me here for a reason. He found me my perfect match. I love you. Everything I've done has been for you, and if you can't see beyond your own stubborn, one-sided views, that is your problem. Without another word, he turned and stalked out. She sat down slowly in the office chair, her legs shaking so hard they wouldn't hold her up anymore. Willa heard banging and rustling in the room next door, their bedroom, and moments later, she saw Ryder walking by with a suitcase, his strides measured, and his face a cold mask. He didn't look at her, and her heart seemed to seize in her chest. He was leaving. What had she done? She laid her head down in her folded arms, wishing she could cry, but the tears wouldn't come. Hours later, Willa sat on the couch, rubbing Honey's soft ears as the dog snored next to her. Her body was still, but her mind wouldn't stop moving, replaying the arguments they'd had, worrying about the ranch, feeling awful at the thought of what it might mean to lose everything and what her grandfather would think. She couldn't make herself get up and waited to hear the back door open, Ryder's heavy footsteps and his upbeat voice asking her what was for dinner. Just the thought of food made her stomach churn uneasily. She wished she could talk to someone. She wished someone would tell her what to do. Things were so much easier when it wasn't her in charge. When she did finally hear the door open, she scrambled awkwardly to her feet. Ryder? Just me, came Mrs. Hollis's voice, sounding more gravelly than usual. Ryder sent me to see if you needed anything. She came to the doorway of the living room, tiny fists on her hips. There was a remoteness to her expression that Willa hadn't seen before. No, I'm okay, Willa answered stiffly. Mrs. Hollis nodded once, briskly, and turned to leave. Wait, Mrs. Hollis. Please. Where is he? The older woman raised her eyebrows at Willa's pleading tone, and her face softened a bit. In the bunkhouse with the men. Well, what ones we have left? He hadn't left the ranch. She let out the breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. I do need a favor after all. Would you call Brody for me and ask him to come by as soon as he can? I'll be in the office. Willa wheeled her scooter that way, leaving Mrs. Hollis shaking her head disapprovingly. Brody's not the one you should be talking to right now, she muttered, but went to call him anyway. No, Brody said firmly. You're not thinking straight, Willa. Selling the ranch isn't the answer. Well, what is, then? Willa threw her hands in the air. The ranch is the problem between Ryder and me, so I should just get rid of it, right? That's what he wants. Brody shook his head uncomfortably. I can't tell you what to do, Willa, but this isn't something you've thought through. You haven't even talked to Ryder about it, doesn't he have a say? You think this is what he would want, but I've worked with him every day for the past several weeks. He already loves this place, probably as much as you do. When we started losing men to the Silver Sage, he took up as much slack as I did and worked 3 times as hard. Didn't you even notice how exhausted he's been? Another pang of guilt ran through Willa. She'd noticed that Ryder had seemed tired, but she just figured it was because he wasn't used to the daily physical work that ranching required. After Brody left, his usual friendly attitude a little distant, Willa stayed at the desk, staring at the unchanging numbers on the computer. She didn't know how to fix this, and there was no one she could talk to. Mrs. Hollis and Brody hadn't come right out and said anything, but she could feel their disapproval. She hated conflict, and she hated feeling like a disappointment. Before she was fully conscious of what she was doing, Willa was digging through her desk drawer for a small, purple-lined business card. The phone rang twice before a cheery voice answered, "Matrimony. How can we help you?" "Dr. Lachele," Willa said in an unsteady voice. "This is Willa Griffin, Willa Pearce." "Willa!" Lachele exclaimed warmly. "How are you, girl? How's that handsome man of yours, keeping you busy?" The woman chuckled. "I've got a problem," Willa said miserably, her voice clogging with tears that still refused to be shed. "I've messed everything up." "Come on, now," Lachele said kindly. "How bad can it be?" "Bad. Ryder moved out to the bunkhouse today." Just saying it out loud made Willa duck her head in shame even though Dr. Lachele couldn't see her. But to Willa's surprise, the doctor gave a tinkling laugh. "I've heard of the doghouse, but this is the first time one of my clients has been sent to the bunkhouse." "Tell me all about it, Snickerdoodle. Let's see what we can do to fix it." Within minutes, Lachele, in her no-nonsense way, cut straight to the heart of the matter. "Which thought hurts you more, sweetie, the thought of losing the ranch and disappointing your grandfather, who is beyond caring about what happens here on Earth, or the thought of losing Ryder, the man you love and who God helped pick out just for you?" Put that way, the answer was simple. She loved Ryder. He was the most important thing in her life, and she didn't have to go it alone anymore. Together, they would decide how to fix everything. She thanked Dr. Lachele and promised to update her in a few days, feeling as if a weight was lifted from her shoulders when she finally hung up. It was full dark by the time she got off the phone, and Honey was whimpering to go out, so Willa grabbed her cell phone to call her husband while she was waiting for the dog to finish her business. The call rang several times and rolled over to voicemail, the friendly sound of Ryder's voice telling her to leave a message only strengthening her need to talk to him in person. "Ryder, it's me. Please call me. We need to talk. I love you, and I'm sorry. I want to fix things, but I need your help." She hung up, and opened the door, whistling for Honey. Outside, the snow was falling so heavily, she couldn't see the floodlights in the truck lot. She whistled again, and Honey staggered through the door, her fur already weighed down with clumps of heavy, wet snow. "Not a good night to have to go outside," she commented to the dog, brushing her off in the mudroom as best she could. Suddenly vaguely nervous, though she'd seen enough South Dakota blizzards that she shouldn't have been, she dialed Ryder's number again. No answer. Brody, though, picked up on the second ring when she called him, and he sounded stressed. "Brody, where's Ryder?" Willa asked urgently. "I'm not sure. Beulah went missing, and he headed out on Frederick to find her. I haven't been able to get an answer on his cell." "Frederick? That's too much horse for him." Willa pictured the temperamental black horse and felt cold all over. Brody shot back irritably, "Give your husband some credit. He rides like he was born to it, and those two have been inseparable since you've been laid up. Ryder can handle Frederick just fine. It's the weather I'm worried about." Yet another thing she didn't know about Ryder. "Sorry, Brody. I need you to come get me. Bring a sled or something. I need to get to the barn." Chapter 10. It wasn't easy, but by the time Brody got to the house, Willa was ready. She'd cut some long johns to fit over her cast and had layered up as protection from the elements. She'd also pulled together some extra supplies, a first aid kit, flashlights, some hand warmers and emergency blankets, and extra gloves and hats in a waterproof bag. Even as warmly as she was dressed, though, the wind still cut through her clothes like icy fingers. Brody pulled her quickly through the already foot-deep snow, but it still seemed to take hours to reach the barn. "What now, boss?" Brody asked as he carried Willa into the barn and deposited her on a bench. The familiar sense of horse and hay surrounded her, and she realized how much she'd missed this place. "Can you saddle up Star for me? And get the guys together. We need to organize a search party." "Willa, you can't ride with that foot," Brody protested, running a hand through his dark blonde hair in frustration. "I can and I will," she replied. 10 minutes later, with a boost from Brody, she and Star were ready to head out. Star pranced excitedly, overjoyed to see her, and Willa leaned over his neck, rubbing his neck and murmuring soothing words to calm him. She wasn't worried about riding. Star was so well trained that he'd respond to the reins or her voice if she chose, but she couldn't afford to make any mistakes out there herself. If she fell off or was thrown, she'd immediately become a liability to the rest of the search team. But she had to be out there looking for Ryder. She couldn't just wait at home. In moments, one by one, they were ready to go. Brody, Hollis, young Billy, and 3 more men she hadn't met yet were all ready for their search. With a pang, she realized that this was what their staff of 15 had been reduced to. Mrs. Hollis was staying behind to brew coffee and man the walkie-talkies. Billy slid open the big barn doors, and they filed out into the blizzard. Willa had to shout to be heard over the howl of the wind. "Fan out," she instructed the men. "We're starting from the break in the south paddock." Tracking Ryder would be impossible. From what Brody had been able to tell, Ryder had been out at least 2 hours, and the raging storm had blown in nearly an hour ago. Any tracks were covered under several inches of fresh powder, and the driving snow made it impossible to see, anyway. "Please, God," Willa prayed fervently. "Please help me find him." 15 minutes passed with what felt like agonizing slowness, with only the occasional lights from the other searchers visible when the wind gusts changed direction. The cold was chewing through her thick gloves slowly, making her fingers ache where they curled around the reins. Her eyes felt gritty as she squinted against the snow, already coating Star's mane, and each shadow or bump or hill she lit up with her high-powered lantern made her heart jump. But there was no sign of Ryder, Beulah, or Frederick. 15 minutes turned to a half hour and then 45 minutes, and Brody rode up alongside her. "You need to get back to the barn, Willa," he yelled. "You're going to freeze out here." His blonde eyebrows were caked with snow, and he looked like a yeti. "I'm not going back yet," she hollered back. "I have to find him." "We will," Brody replied, but his face was drawn with worry. 15 more minutes, she yelled, urging a faster walk out of Star. "Please, God, please God." Her prayer had become a litany. Brody nodded grimly and fell away to his place in line. It felt like another hour, but only a few minutes had passed when her searchlight caught the gleam of eyes out of the darkness. Her first thought was wolves, but the eyes were too high up. Her heart picking up in rhythm, she changed direction and headed that way. Frederick, the big black beast, was plodding through the snow, head down, coat caked with ice. Behind him, being led by a rope tied to the saddle pommel, was Beulah. The small cow was moving slowly, but she was alive. "Ryder!" Willa screamed, but the wind caught her words and threw them into the night. She drew closer and flashed her light in their direction. Her husband's snow-covered head appeared over Frederick's back, and he lifted a stiff arm to wave to her. Tears were freezing on her cheeks as she gave the word to the men over the walkie-talkie that her husband had been found. Ryder shivered uncontrollably, convinced he'd never be warm again. He had been so tired, so convinced that the best thing to do was just lie down in the snow and sleep, but the thought of leaving Willa with everything wrong between them was enough to keep him moving. He thought at first that she was a figment of his frozen brain, riding up to him out of the darkness on Star, and as soon as he realized that somehow, she was actually here, he immediately wanted to yell at her for putting herself in danger by riding out looking for him. He was too cold to yell, though. Ryder's second thought was that even though she was bundled into baggy, shapeless cold-weather gear, and what little he could see of her face was snow-covered and red, Willa was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. She brought Star alongside him to shield him from the wind and leaned over to hug him tightly. Her coat was so frozen it crackled in his ear, but he couldn't feel it against his cheek. Ryder could smell her, though, the fresh, woodsy scent, underlaid with the strawberry shampoo she used. He wanted to hold her, but with her ankle, Willa probably wouldn't be able to get back on the horse. God willing, he would survive the rest of the trip back, and, if his arms didn't freeze completely off from the cold first, he'd hold her then. Brody grinned and slapped him on the back. "Darned idiot," he yelled affectionately at Ryder. "Even a city slicker like you should know better than to head out in a blizzard." It was true. Like Willa had said to him earlier, Ryder had no business thinking he could do any of this. He was just a PR guy from the East Coast who happened to like Western history. He had little time to beat himself up, though. Ryder was quickly stripped of his soggy sheepskin coat, hat, and gloves and given a dry coat, mittens, and another hat pulled from someone's saddlebags. Next, he had a warm pack shoved down his shirt to rest on his chest, was wrapped in emergency blankets, given a thermos of cocoa to sip from, and bundled onto the sled like an overgrown child. He was honestly too exhausted to be embarrassed. Willa sat curled up on the couch across from Ryder. It was nearly 2 o'clock in the morning, and Ryder was sleeping soundly, but she kept the light on low, just to watch him sleep. She had been so afraid that she had lost him, and even after she'd found him, the ride home was torture. Knowing how cold he was, wondering if he would lose fingers or toes to frostbite, worrying about cardiac arrest caused by hypothermia. Now, that he was home and warm and whole, she couldn't take her eyes off him. The ever-efficient Mrs. Hollis had coffee, hot soup, and a doctor waiting at the main house when they'd returned. Fargo Wesley, a grumpy old country doctor who had been grumpy and old as long as Willa could remember, had looked Ryder over and pronounced that her husband must have had the dumbest luck in the universe, because he was frostbite-free, only had a mild case of hypothermia, and likely wouldn't suffer any after-effects from his blizzard chasing. They hadn't had a chance to talk, with the jubilant crowd that had gathered in the kitchen to congratulate him on surviving his first South Dakota blizzard. Finally, Mrs. Hollis had shooed them all out, promising everyone chili in the bunkhouse kitchen, and it was just Honey, Willa, and Ryder in the big house. He'd seemed subdued when everyone was there, and when they were gone, had fallen asleep wrapped in blankets, Honey sprawled across his feet, before she could even talk to him. Willa fell asleep studying the way the dim, golden light cast shadows on Ryder's stubble-roughened cheeks, thanking God again and again for saving the man she loved. Hearing Willa's breathing even into sleep, Ryder cracked open one eye. He felt like a coward for pretending he was passed out from exhaustion just to avoid talking to his own wife, but he wasn't ready to hear her carry on the same city slicker refrain everyone else on the ranch had already subjected him to. He knew Brody, the ranch hands, and even the curmudgeonly doctor were all just teasing him, but Willa was another story. Getting lost like he had probably confirmed to her every point of their argument that day. He didn't belong here. Willa woke to a rustling noise and a muffled curse. It was still dark, and someone was moving around the living room. "Ryder?" she called out. Something clattered to the floor with a metallic noise, and she reached over to switch on the table lamp. Willa caught her husband, clad in just sweatpants, in the act of tripping over her scooter. "What are you doing up? Do you need something?" "I'm fine," he said with a wry smile. "Just a little chilly. I was going to look for some more blankets. Sorry to wake you." He disappeared down the hall, toward their bedroom. When he came back, Willa had scooted further into the deep couch, patting the cushions in front of her. "I think we can conserve body heat if you sleep over here," she said shyly, looking up at him with a pleading expression in her big, dark eyes that he was helpless to resist. He stretched out his long length on the couch, switching the lamp off and pulling the blankets over them. He couldn't help his shudder of pleasure as Willa scooched up tight against his back and wrapped her free arm around his chest. She felt so warm and good pressed up against him, and there had been some dark moments that night when he would never have thought he'd get the chance to feel her arms around him again. "I was so afraid for you," she whispered against his back, as if she had read his thoughts. "I'm sorry," he murmured. "For everything. All the problems with the ranch lately, your accident, being such a tenderfoot that everyone had to risk frostbite to come out looking for me." Her hold on him only tightened. "You're not the only cowboy ever to get lost looking for an animal. It only shows what kind of man you are that would risk his life for a heifer." She punched him in the back sharply and surprised a laugh out of him. "Not that I ever want you to do that again." And I'm sorry, she added, her voice suddenly thick. Check your voicemail messages later. I figured out what an idiot I had been before I even knew you were gone. I called you to tell you that I don't care if we downsize or sell the ranch altogether. She sniffled, and he could feel her trembling against his back. The accident wasn't your fault, and I couldn't have handled the Circle G's problems any better than you have. For a PR guy from the East Coast, you've been incredible. You mean more to me than this place ever has or ever will. I should have realized it sooner. I love you, Ryder. He dislodged her arm and rolled over in one quick movement, finding her mouth with his in a long, searching kiss that heated them both to the core. I love you, too, Willa, he said, breaking away long enough to press his forehead to hers. I love you. Tears streamed down her cheeks, and, mortified, Willa tried to wipe them away. I'm sorry, she whispered. I never cry. Yeah, well. Ryder lifted her hand to touch his damp cheek in the darkness. Neither do I. The next few weeks went by in a blur for Willa and Ryder. The nights were long, and not much sleep was had, but neither of them were complaining. Days were spent holed up in Willa's office together, planning what was to be done about the ranch. There were a few arguments and once a full-out fight, but with their new understanding, the two of them managed to never go to bed angry. They decided to downsize a bit, selling off some of the herd, and focus specially on their Black Angus, with Ryder running a new PR campaign for the Circle G that targeted private contracts, rather than commercial ones. Crunching the numbers, Willa determined that they could get by with a smaller number of ranch hands who received better pay and a lighter daily workload, while still managing to break even in the long run. One aspect of the business negotiations that Ryder refused to budge on was the addition of 2 two-week vacations per year for everyone on the ranch, including Willa and Ryder. Willa argued but was outmatched, and before she knew it, Ryder was happily planning a trip to Florida in May, to begin the very same day, whatever day that happened to be, that Willa's doctor declared her ankle fully healed. Wife, you're scowling, Ryder observed, as he pulled up pictures on the computer of the white sand beaches they'd be lounging on in the spring. If you don't knock that off, I'm not taking you to Disney World. I can't believe you think we should just leave for that long. Who knows what might happen while we're gone? Do you even know how busy spring gets around this place? I know exactly what will happen, Ryder retorted, giving her a piercing look from his blue eyes. Brody, our good friend who has been your foreman for 15 years, will keep the place from falling apart while we're gone. You trust him to do his job, right? It's not that, Willa said weakly. Come on, Willa, Ryder said, more gently. Loosen up on the reins, remember? She sighed and gave him a narrow-eyed look. 10 days. Not a second longer. 14, and you have a deal. Their vacation was planned for 14 days. Christmas morning dawned bright and clear with old carols playing on the stereo, and the tinsel on the scrubby spruce Ryder had dragged into the living room sparkled in the cold winter sunlight. Amazon and the UPS delivery trucks had been given a workout in the days leading up to the holidays, and colorful wrapping paper littered the floor as if an explosion had gone off. The smell of cinnamon and nutmeg came from the kitchen, where what was left of Willa's successful attempt at a coffee cake sat on the counter. Honey happily gnawed on a huge bone atop a flannel and fleece dog bed in one corner of the room. Christmas is over, Ryder groaned, collapsing back on the couch cushions that crinkled under him with discarded paper and pulling his new black Stetson down over his eyes. This was always my least favorite part of the day as a kid. When all the presents had been opened. Willa laughed. Then you're in luck. I've got a couple more surprises. She reached under the couch and pulled out a small, flat package. What's this? Ryder asked, tearing at the paper without waiting for an answer. Cool. Another history book. That's not just any history book. Open it up to the bookmarked page. Ryder flipped open the book in puzzlement, started reading, and then hooped out loud. You're kidding. The story about my grandpa and Wild Bill is true. How did you find this? He asked excitedly, grinning like a kid. It took some research, Willa admitted proudly. I can't believe this, he murmured, reading the page again. My grandpa really did eat chicken and dumplings with Wild Bill Hickok and then marry the saloon girl. I can't wait to tell Dr. Lachele. Oh, Willa said casually. There's something else you're probably going to want to mention to Lachele, too. This time, she reached between the couch cushions and pulled out a small, skinny package with an oversized, slightly squashed red bow on it. Ryder's brows drew together as she tossed it to him. This tiny package he opened more slowly. The confusion on his face changed to complete astonishment, and then, absolute joy. With one shaking hand, he held up the positive pregnancy test. You're sure? He asked. Sure, as I can be, Willa smiled. I sent Mrs. Hollis to the drugstore in town to buy 2 boxes of those, and I went through them all. You're going to be a daddy, Ryder Pearce. Honey barked scoldingly as Ryder dropped the test and vaulted across the coffee table to wrap his arms around her. And you're going to be a mommy, Willa Pearce. He drew back and looked at her with concern. Are you okay with this? She squeezed his hands, looked into his eyes, and said what was in her heart. I'm terrified. I don't know the first thing about being a mom. But, especially after these last few weeks, I know that I don't have to know all the answers. You and I are in this together, and no matter how you look at it, a baby is a blessing. I'm absolutely okay with this. A tear trickled down her cheek, and she automatically swiped at it, but Ryder was there first, gently brushing it away with his big thumb. You know it's okay to cry, right, Willa? His own eyes were suspiciously bright. Yeah, I'm starting to figure that out. She gave a watery laugh and pulled a thick book out from between the couch cushions where the pregnancy test had been hiding. It says in here what to expect when you're expecting that I'm probably going to be crying for the next several months, so we'd better get used to it. Ryder laughed again and pulled Willa close, smoothing her silky black hair. Together, we've got this. Boy or girl, we'll raise them with every ounce of love we have to give. And, he added, at least you know I'm good at bottle feeding, if you need help in that department. Epilogue. Dr. Lachele was on the phone with Lighthouser PR on the matrimony landline when her cell phone buzzed on the desk beside her. She picked it up, swiped the screen automatically, and then squealed, interrupting Jerry Lighthouser mid-monologue. The photo that had just been sent to her showed a wrinkled-up little prune of a baby girl, with a shock of thick, dark hair and eyes that Lachele was just sure would still be blue in a few months. It's a girl, she crowed. I just knew it. Who's a what? Your old partner Ryder is a daddy. He sent me a pic of my newest matrimony munchkin. She quickly printed the photo. Well, that's good for him. Bad for me, though. Why's that, Ja? Lachele practically danced over to her wall of munchkins and pinned up the newest edition. Belinda, Bernadette, and Beatrice are going to be bummed. But Lachele was hardly listening. Raven Pearce, she said admiringly. What a dramatic name for such a tiny little girl. I approve. Oh, listen, Jerry, I have to go. I'm getting another call. Talk to you next week. She couldn't help but wish Willa was right there so she could give her a huge booby bump. She danced back to her desk and clicked the button to switch lines. Matrimony, she sang out. What can we do for you? Ah, is this Dr. Lachele? A man's deep voice poured like honey through the speaker, and Lachele grinned. She did like a man with a nice-sounding voice. Speaking, she chirped. My name is Brody Williams. I'm a friend of Willa and Ryder Pearce, and I was wondering if you could do some matchmaking for me.